Good evening, Thomas. How are we doing tonight?
Doing good. How are you?
Doing A-OK. I had a meeting with a journalist and got stuck in traffic, and it was rather miserable. And it's cold as fuck in the nation's capital. But I'm doing okay. To be honest with you, I'm doing A-OK. I'm looking forward to tomorrow being a federal holiday, which I will use to catch up on all the work I didn't do, because that's how it is in America. And yeah, can't complain, Thomas. Can't complain.
Well, good. That was a excuse me. That was an interesting article that came out that came out today. I still haven't made it all the way through, so
You know,
look
I
forward
thought
to hearing.
I thought we would do this. So Charles could go through it, with a fine-tooth comb, as it were, do a Socratic, esoteric reading of the piece. Um, what is there to say? Well, let's start with the piece itself. Thomas, do you have a free copy of it that you could find and tweet out, maybe an archive one? Because I know that it's
Yeah,
gated behind
yeah.
paywall.
I've got
Yeah.
one.
Okay.
I'm driving right now, and I'm about 5 minutes from home. So as soon as I get home, I'll pop it up in the jumbotron for everybody.
But if anyone else has it and wants to be up on the stage and asking questions about it before we get going, I'm going to brew myself some chamomile tea and get to it. Hold on one second. And then I'm going to share up in the jumbotron. We are going to. Thank you, dear future citizen. Let's put that up in the jumbotron, and then let's put up my comment on it. By the way, I'm often asked why I do these spaces, and I want to give something of an account of myself on it, or why I do the Substack. I mean, Charles, don't you do all this other shit like investing and running your genetics company? Like, what's up with all this? Why are you doing this? Well, I am now 35 years old, and that could well be middle-aged for me. Not quite sure. And I got a little tired about all of the bullshit that I knew was just fake that was in the media, and things that I personally had experienced, personally saw during the Trump years, and I felt somewhat guilty about it. And I continue to be guilted by it. And I wanted to warn the younger generations about all the crazy shit that I had seen so that they might, not necessarily fall into the same traps I did. And of course, I, wanted to leave a record of kind of what I had done and maybe that others might be inspired by it. So that's kind of the long and short of it. Now let's read the piece, okay? Let's do some of that. Let's be good. Let's do the homework. And for those of you who didn't do the homework, this is a recorded space, so you can go back and look at it. Okay. Peter Thiel is taking a break from democracy. It's one of his many, many disappointments, by Barton Gellman. Now, I should mention Barton Gellman came to visit me at a French restaurant when I was in New York. I don't know if it was last week or the week before that. I think it was the week before that. And I was in New York on business at this French restaurant I rather love there. I am a huge Francophile, for those who don't know. I grew up speaking French. And of course, as anyone knows, the Germans and the French, they don't necessarily get along. So I like going to these kind of places. And particularly, there's lots of places in New York that are restaurants, but they're also kind of listening posts. There are places where lots of different types of people gather. And one of the things that most people don't really understand about a lot of high-end restaurants, particularly those near consulates or near embassies, is that it's not just about the food. Let's just put it that way. So anyway, Barton Gellman, who I had great respect for, and still to some extent have respect for. Barton Gellman was one of the reporters who worked on the Snowden situation, Ed Snowden, and all of that back in the day. And he reached out to me when a story came out on October 19th, 2023, in Business Insider, essentially outing my role as an FBI informant and the role I played in recruiting Peter Thiel to also be an FBI informant, and kind of what I was after. And there's going to be other pieces, I think, by Schwartz. I know there's some other pieces out there that are going to come out about, what I was doing with Thiel and with others, with Musk, and kind of wanted to just talk about these things. One of the problems in general of our time is that, you meet with these journalists, and yes, they have like big social proof and they have big, followings, and there's all this credit and everything. And like, it's cool to be in the Atlantic and like, ooh, New York Times or whatever. But that's not really my style. Like, I'm not really one of those people. Like, I'm the person who like hangs out at the coffee shop, local coffee shop, or likes going to church with like, normal, regular people. I've never really liked being different from other people personally. I've never really wanted to be different from other people. I've always wanted to fit in. I am that shallow. And so, what has happened in my life is, unfortunately, I have been given certain gifts and circumstances that have made it so that I'm at the center of certain events in life. I don't really understand why. I think it like runs in the family. I don't really get it, but I'm sort of trapped with it. Anyway, where were we? Yeah, so let's sort of tuck into this. So Barton Gellman calls me. He invites me to meet him in New York. I'm in New York on business. Being an idiot, I left my wallet back home and sort of talked myself onto a plane, which is, I don't know if any of you have had that experience. It's quite a doozy. So I went there, spent like the day in New York, came back. Never want to spend that much time in a third world country. And anyway, so we met for about 2 hours. We'd spoken a few times on the phone before that, and we sort of got to it. And what he was interested in, he had been following Thiel around, and he was very interested in the piece that Matthias Schwartz had done for Business Insider. And in particular, he was interested in this line of mine about how I had recruited Thiel to work for the FBI. I think it was something like "join up or get crushed." That was the line in question. And I had spoken a lot to Gelman about the role of the Israelis, my sort of concerns generally about Founders Fund. And one of the things that happens in a lot of these types of stories is that they kind of play a game, right? They don't really tell you everything you need to know about what's going on. Now, there's also this line in the Business Insider piece about how I did all this because I was upset about money. Well, candidly, like, I'm a multimillionaire. I don't really like being rich. It complicates relationships with families. Certainly better than being poor, but there's one of the problems of being rich is that when you're poor, you can blame all the problems you have in life on how you're poor, basically. But then when you start having money, like a little bit of money, then you have to like actually examine yourself and all the fucked up things you are. And that's kind of one of the problems of having money, just generally. And then there's all these responsibilities that kind of nag at you. Um, so anyway, so where was I on this? Oh yeah, okay. So there's this line in the Schwartz piece. Johnson told Insider he introduced Thiel to Buma, then exposed him because Johnson felt betrayed that Thiel did not invest in Johnson's own startups, which he had expected Thiel to do in the exchange. In fact, one of the conditions I made of helping Peter get right with the deep state was that he and Founders Fund would actually begin working on technology that was in the national interest, not just my company, but other companies as well. And that they would actually do rigorous due diligence on companies that they were funding. Unfortunately, that's not really the case. They've been funding a lot of like Israeli connected or Russian connected companies like Neuralink, which is a Musk property, which we can get into if people are curious about that. Probably won't be talking too much about Musk in this piece tonight, though, just because there's sort of things a brewing there. Um, let's see here. I wanted to share, and of course, One thing I want to talk about generally is how oligarchs use funding their own media, funding their own sense making apparatus as a means of basically making it so it's very hard for the rest of us to kind of really pay attention to what's going on. Now let's see here. Da, 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 da. I want to share a few other things. Um, yeah, so this piece from October 19th, I think, is also worthwhile paying attention to. I'll share that in the Jumbotron too. Um, yeah, so I guess what I would just say is I believe that technology is about making the world a better place and not just about making money. I believe that technology in particular is about trying to change the world for the better. And I believe that we have an obligation, those of us who are intelligent, those of us who have these kind of gifts, to try to make the world a better place. And I've tried to do that in a number of my technology investing, whether that's in satellites or submarine technology or solar powered cars or kind of all the whole litany of things that I've been involved in, genetics, facial recognition. If you've been in my spaces, you kind of know it. I've written about some of this stuff on my Substack. You can kind of see it for yourself. Um, Now, what I wanted to do when we sort of like think about this piece is really kind of tuck into it, really get into it. All right. So Barton Gellman works for a property. This property is called the Atlantic. It's currently owned by Laureen Powell Jobs. Laureen Powell Jobs being the widow of Steve Jobs, and Laureen Powell Jobs obviously was very close to Ghislaine Maxwell. There's those famous photos of Ghislaine Maxwell meeting with Laureen Powell Jobs, and of course it's edited by a guy named Jeffrey Goldberg. Jeffrey Goldberg is a or named Jeffrey Goldberg. Jeffrey Goldberg is a he's a former prison warden, I think, a prison guard of some form in Israel. So he is a dual American Israeli citizen. And this is important because it's important for you to understand that there was until the Ukraine war a kind of axis between Germany, Russia, and the Likud, and that Thiel was very much at the center of this axis. And now that Peter is being sort of kicked out of politics, he's off the board of Facebook. Palantir is getting contracts from the National Health Service, but Palantir is being very much assimilated into the British sphere. There's a lot of things going on here, and we need to kind of understand these relationships. Now, I've talked about Peter's father in the past and Peter's uncle, who died under very suspicious circumstances. The uncle in Oak Ridge, near Oak Ridge, Tennessee, back in the day. He's Peter's, German born. He has, a German mother and I believe an Austrian mother. And Peter is very involved in both Austrian and German politics. He has sort of relationships there, whether it's, Matthias Dampfner's son working for him, Matthias Dampfner being the head of Axel Springer, which I've written about before. And Axel Springer, of course, tied into KKR, the famous private equity fund that is also backing Founders Fund. Now, which is the venture fund that Thiel runs. Now, I should mention too, so I'm 35 now. I first met Peter when I was 19. And like a lot of 19-year-olds, I was sort of swept up in the whole like create your own company, do as Mark Zuckerberg did, all of that good stuff. And we actually met at a Leo Strauss conference discussing one of the more interesting books about Machiavelli that's out there. And so yeah, so anyway, so Teal and I've known each other a long time, and I became a kind of aide de camp of his, a kind of lieutenant of his. Though I was always kind of independent. I was never like officially one of the Tealverse. I was always doing my own thing, and it's I who got Teal to become a delegate to the Republican Party and ultimately helped him get a speaking role in the 2016 election. Um, Now, for what it's worth, I don't. I have complicated views about Mr. Trump. I think Trump is a more complicated figure than people really understand. Um, but in 2016, I was a supporter of his, or really, I was more an anti-Hillary supporter. So that sort of understands my politics at that time. And I honestly believe that Trump, being a moderate Republican type from Manhattan, that he would do things like give us single-payer health care. That he was actually a much more interesting figure than people kind of kind of thought. And Thiel and I had known each other as well because we worked together at taking apart Gawker, which was a publication that was funded by a Russian oligarch, a guy by the name of Viktor Vekselberg. And Viktor Vekselberg would later be sanctioned by the US in large measure because of his relationships with the Putin regime. So Peter and I took that apart. I sued Pro Se, of all things. People always make fun of me for suing Pro Se, but I always kind of liked it personally. I think it's kind of fun to be your own lawyer in certain cases, not every case. And so I sued in Missouri. We sort of bankrupted Gawker. I ended up making some money off of that. And then Peter owed me some money from some of the work we had done. And rather than collect the full $1 million he owed me, I said just invest $200,000 in what became Clearview AI, the facial recognition company. And there's some stuff about this in The Contrarian, the Max Chafkin book. I'm kind of quoted throughout that book. There's also some stuff in this, some stuff out there that will kind of continue to come out as time goes on about my role basically recruiting and turning various compromised billionaires in the US context. And it's something that I have done for quite a long time. I've also spent a lot of time meeting with kind of figures that get in trouble with the SEC or the FBI or DOJ. And I have those people, rather than go to jail or get in trouble with law enforcement, I have them invest in things that are deep state projects that are sort of friendly to the US government or to allied governments. There's a lot of people that, had trouble with the SEC, but suddenly they invested in the Ukrainian war effort, right? You might have noticed there's a lot more billionaires these days being a lot more charitable in all kinds of weird ways. Or they're exiting politics in ways you don't really understand, or they're making certain business decisions that seem kind of more like they were directed from some other player. Whether that, is George Soros, who now has his Open Society Foundation that's run by Mark Malek Brown, whether that's Facebook, which has Nick Clegg is the shot caller there now, and there's all fight over Facebook that's going on with all those lawsuits and everything. Of course, replacing Sheryl Sandberg, whose family had all these connections with Menachem Begin and the kind of Likud Israelis. So there's a kind of fight going on. It's a sort of shadow war where people are turning and changing a lot of these tech companies or compromise private equity funds or what have you. Anyway, let's get into the piece without kind of more further ado. I want to be, by the way, if there's any questions or whatever, people want to come up or they have a comment. I've gotten the question of like, am I worried about Peter suing me? No, because for one, I think this idea that Peter was just trying to destroy the free press isn't entirely true. I mean, he was going after Gawker, which was backed by the Russians. It's a singularly bad publication. And if he does sue me, which I don't think he will, in fact, I may sue him for reasons we'll get into later. If he does sue me, truth is an absolute defense against libel, right? And I trust that a courtroom of my fellow citizens, should it get to a jury or should it get to a judge, I trust that a judge will be discerning that I'm, speaking about these issues in the interests of the public. Okay. Any questions before we get started or tuck into the article as a whole? Does anyone want to raise their hand or speak or say anything? Tom, is there anything you want to add, Tom, or are we good to go?
You may want to get closer to your
My
routers. I don't
router.
know.
Yes. Hold on.
Everybody give a thumbs up if he was going in and out a little bit, or if it was just me.
I kind of fuck
Saw
around
my
with the
reaction.
microphone on my thing. So what I'll do is I'll have my chamomile tea next to my router. Okay. Cool. Yeah, and thanks Tom for sharing some of that stuff. Okay. Um, I want to say too, one thing to really understand about Thiel is Thiel has all these connections with the German world, with the Russian world. A lot of these connections have gone on for quite a long time. And whether that's his father's connections to the Chinese through the mining industry or to apartheid South Africa through the extraction of uranium from Namibia, or to the French and to Rene Girard and that whole kind of network. I think that all this stuff is kind of very important for people to know. You can't just take these people at their word about what they're doing, right? You have to interrogate them, see what their history is, see what's really going on behind the scenes, right? And I think that that's crucially and critically important, particularly when these institutions increasingly have a lot of say over, how we get healthcare, how we get access to space, how we interact with technology. These things are very important. And you want to make sure that the people who are building these products aren't compromised or blackmailed by foreign governments. And as we saw with the Musk situation in Ukraine, where he, is very close to the Russians, he was very worried about how the Russians would treat his involvement in the Ukraine conflict. So he kind of stopped an exercise to attack the Russian fleet. So, when you're looking at these kind of like oligarchs, you need to understand them as basically like this private empire world. And there's a danger when a private empire gets larger than the US government. It's, in fact, a very dangerous kind of thing for the whole world. Okay, let's get into this story, all right? So, for those who are reading at home, it's the first link up in the Jumbotron if you scroll the way over. All right. Now, one thing to think about when we think about the Atlantic, the Atlantic is a kind of Likud pro Israel publication. And so we're going to read this together. It's rather long, and I will kind of stop at times. If people want to say things or they want to, they want to message something. If you want to send me a comment or whatever, my DMs are open. Okay. It wasn't clear at first why Peter Thiel agreed to talk to me, the me being Barton Gellman. He is famously no friend of the media. But Thiel, co-founder of PayPal and Palantir, avatar of techno-libertarianism, boogeyman of the left, consented to a series of long interviews at his home and office in Los Angeles. He was more open than I expected him to be, and he had a lot to say. But the impetus for these conversations? He wanted me to publish a promise he was going to make so that he would not be tempted to go back on his word. And what was that thing he needed to say loudly? That he wouldn't be giving money to any politician, including Donald Trump, in the next presidential campaign. Already, he had endured the wrath of Trump. Thiel tried to duck Trump's calls for a while, but in late April, the former president managed to get him on the phone. Trump reminded Thiel that he had backed two of Thiel's proteges, Blake Masters and J.D. Vance, in their Senate races last year. Thiel had given each of them more than $10 million. Now Trump wanted Thiel to give the same to him. Now, I think we need to kind of understand here what's going on in this opening. Okay? So first, it's illegal to solicit campaign contributions beyond the legal limit. Of course, it happens all the time, but there's, you're not supposed to be able to do that. It's kind of tantamount in a certain sense to a shakedown of a sort, right? You can't, you have to limit the donations. I think the federal limit is like, what is it now? It's like 50, it's got to be like 5,600 or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it is. I haven't donated since 2022. So I think that that's just important. Now, we should also note, too, that Thiel gave some money to J.D. Vance. He also, to a super PAC supporting J.D. Vance. He also gave some money to a super PAC supporting Blake Masters. J.D. Vance won his race. He won the primary, which was tantamount to winning the general election, given the PVI score of Ohio. And one of the people who pushed J.D. Vance over the finish line was at the primary level was Congressman Matt Gaetz. And so there's a relationship there that goes back as well. And so that's sort of thing one to understand. Thing two to understand is that one of the things that's often not really understood about a lot of these super PACs is that there are ways of paying assets or friends of yours. Somebody says it's seemingly $6,600 now, which is the maximum amount you can donate. I guess it's not indexed for inflation. But anyways, so people are sending me stuff that Thiel connects to Opus Dei and all this other stuff. Yeah, Thiel connects to a lot of things. And that's kind of beyond the scope of this thing. We can maybe get into that if people want to. Thiel is a backer of Leonard Leo, right? He gave money to Leonard Leo, who, of course, in turn back to Josh Hawley. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. Just, by the way, I'm just putting on my pajamas. So when we think about this opening, right, the conceit is that Thiel wants people to know that he's out of the game. Now, the question is, How much of this was Thiel's choice? How much of this was the US deep state forcing him to stay out of political elections? That, I think, is a very interesting question. And I think it's something that people need to kind of think through a bit more before they kind of rush to conclusions. Okay. All right, ready? We're opening up the piece again. All right. All right. When Thiel declined, Trump told me that he was very sad to hear that, Thiel recounted. He expected way more of me, and that's how the call ended. Months later, word got back to Thiel that Trump had called Masters to discourage him from running uh, for Senate again and had called Thiel a fucking scumbag. Thiel's hope was that this article would, quote, lock me into not giving any money to Republican politicians in 2024. He said, there's always a chance I might change my mind, but by talking to you, it makes it hard for me to change my mind. My husband doesn't want me to give any more money, and he's right. I know they're going to be pestering me like crazy, and by talking to you, it's going to lock me out of the cycle for 2024. This matters because of Thiel's unique role in the American political ecosystem. He is the techiest of tech evangelists, the purest distillation of Silicon Valley's reigning ethos. As such, he has become the embodiment of a strain of thinking that is pronounced and growing among tech founders. In other words, Thiel runs a cult. And why does he want to cut off by the way, that's me speaking, not Gelman. And why does he want to cut off politicians? It's not that they are mediocre as individuals and therefore incapable of bringing about the kind of civilization defining changes a man like him would expect to see. His disappointment runs deeper than that. Their failure to make the world conform to his vision has soured him on the entire enterprise, to the point where he no longer thinks it very much matters who wins the next election. Now, not for the first time, Thiel has lost interest in democracy. Now, of course, there's several ways to read this. This is, of course, me speaking. Um, their failure to make the world conform to his vision has soured him on the entire enterprise. Maybe he's just wrong about how he sees politics working. Maybe they are, in fact, doing something kind of more fundamentally interesting. Maybe they're actually just being a representative form of government. Very, very kind of interesting stuff. Or maybe it's not really Thiel's choice at all. Maybe Thiel's being forced out of the political system by larger forces. Okay, let's continue. Thiel's decision to endorse Trump at the Republican National Convention in 2016 surprised some of his closest friends. Thiel has cultivated an image as a man of ideas, an intellectual who studied philosophy with Rene Girard and owns first editions of Leo Strauss in English and German. Trump quite obviously did not share these interests or Thiel's libertarian principles. Yeah, no shit. Now, of course, the question is, why has Thiel cultivated this image? Like, is that image actually real? Does he really understand Leo Strauss? Does he really understand Rene Girard? It's a very interesting question. Or is this just marketing? Is this kind of like, Sam Bankman Fried created this image of himself, or Musk created his image of himself? Is there something kind of more going on here? Is this a cover, or is this a sincere position? But 4 months earlier, Thiel had seen an omen. On March 18th, 2016, a jury delivered an extraordinary $115 million verdict to Hulk Hogan in his invasion of privacy lawsuit against Gawker Media, whose website had published portions of a sex tape featuring Hogan. Thiel had secretly funded the litigation against Gawker, which had mocked him for years and outed him as gay. The verdict drove the company out of business. For Thiel, the outcome was more than vindication. It was a sign. When the jury came back, quote, this is Thiel being quoted by Gelman, my instant reaction at that point was, wow, maybe Trump wins the election, he told me. In his mind, Gawker was a stand in for the media writ large. Hostile to the presumptive Republican nominee, Hogan was a Trump like figure, and the jury, the voters, had taken his side. So this isn't quite accurate. Thiel had, for a long time, predicted that, in fact, that Trump was going to win, and he and I actually had a dinner in the run up to, I want to say it was in February, that Trump was going to win, and he had promised that he was going to put some money behind a super PAC for Ted Cruz, who had known for a long time, but ultimately he and I spoke at length about Trump and about Cruz and about our mutual antagonist of Gawker, which had lied about me and been really nasty to me over the years. Um, and partly they'd come after me because they knew that I had family connections with the intelligence services, which is its own story. And partly they'd come after me because I'm different. I'm weird. I'm a strange duck. And so at the time, I was married, and my wife at the time was pregnant, and we had suffered a number of miscarriages, and the Gawker stress of being hated and lied about. I mean, they were doing things like lying about my sex life, lying about my business life. My girlfriend, or my wife at the time, couldn't handle that. We lost our child. I sort of made a promise that I would do everything in my power to destroy Gawker. And I discovered basically at one point that that there was somebody funding all these lawsuits against Gawker, and that I had my own lawsuit, but I sort of discovered that there was this other figure. I thought initially it was Dan Loeb, for those who are curious about it. And I sort of acted with Dan Loeb as if, hey man, I kind of know that you're funding these things. And he's like, what the fuck are you talking about? But then I kind of figured out it was Thiel. And I sat down with Thiel at one point, and I said, listen, man, I want in. Like, I know what you're doing. And he was like, how did you figure this out? And I was like, don't worry about that. I want in. I want in on destroying Gawker. And I will help you do that, and we'll work together. And before I got involved, there was this guy, Aaron D'Souza, who was like kind of a loser. And I believe he's being sued in all kinds of weird ways in Australia right now. I don't know the full story, but it's a kind of like gay network that he's a part of there. Literally gay. I mean, I'm not, a lot of these guys are gay, which I think is maybe partly an interesting aspect of this too, because there's a lot of these in the espionage world, in the business world. There's a lot of this sort of thing that works together. Okay, um, let's see here. All right, Thiel himself had not yet publicly embraced Trump. In the Republican primary, he had backed Carly Fiorina, the former Hewlett Packard CEO and a fellow Stanford alum, with a $2 million contribution. By the way, Thiel in this period is very close to Rebecca Mercer, and Mercer is a kind of strange Russian-connected billionairess that I think is worthy of her own space in a different time. Though his candidate had lost, he planned to attend the RNC as a delegate. Yeah, so I helped arrange all of that, by the way, for what it's worth. Then came a call from Donald Trump Jr., a call that I helped arrange. Trump had never met father or son, and had yet to give money to Trump's campaign. But the younger Trump had noticed his name on the delegate list. The convention was 10 days away, and Trump was short on high profile endorsements. Do you want to speak? Don Jr. asked. Thiel thought it might be fun. He sounded out his old friend, Reid Hoffman, the co founder of LinkedIn. And by the way, this is me speaking. Reid Hoffman was extremely close to Jeffrey Epstein. There's like a whole investigation that took place about Hoffman's ties there, that was done at MIT when all that stuff came out. And Hoffman traveled around with Epstein. Hoffman also, crucially, has a lot of connections with the Chinese world. And Hoffman, in particular, is is on the board of Microsoft. He's very helpful to getting not Sam Bankman-Fried, Sam Altman set up with OpenAI. So there's this kind of network here that we're talking about. And Hoffman and Thiel have been friends for many, many years, going back effectively since their college days. All right. So the co-founder of LinkedIn, who has since become his political nemesis. Not quite. They're sort of frenemies. We were talking, and he said, I'm considering going and giving a speech at the Republican National Convention Hoffman recalled. And I laughed, thinking he was joking, right? And he was like, no, 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 I'm not joking. By the way, Hoffman is also very involved with like pro-Israel politics. He sort of attacks the Squad or the sort of more progressive members um, of Congress, and he has a guy named Dimitri, what's his name? Melhorn, I think is his name, and he's very involved with Democratic Majority for Israel, which is a Likud front group designed to target members of Congress for not being sufficiently pro-Israel. It's a kind of AIPAC-like group. And Hoffman, I believe, is funding a primary challenge against Rashida Tlaib, as well as, I think, Cori Bush. Okay, let's continue. For years, Thiel had been saying that he generally favored the more pessimistic candidate in any presidential race, because if you're too pessimistic, it shows you're out of touch. He scorned the rote optimism of politicians who, echoing Ronald Reagan, portrayed America as a shining city on a hill. Trump's America, by contrast, was a broken landscape under siege. So this is, I think, a very important thing to understand. Let's not forget that Thiel is a German, right? He's ethnic German, so he has a sort of German pessimism about him. But I think it's also important to note that there is a kind of desire to show that Americans are not capable of great things, and that there's a kind of pessimism, a kind of nihilism that exists from Europeans, from the Chinese, from others, right? We heard often that the Chinese would say that, oh, America can't build chips again. America can't do this. We can't do all these things. It's not possible. You should just shut up. You American, you're all lazy. You're all fat. You're all dying of fentanyl. So, well, who's selling us the diabetes meds? China. Who's bringing over the fentanyl? China, right? And then, of course, Thiel himself has spent a lot of time in China, and I think that that's an important thing to understand, as well as Thiel's translation of a book called America Against America by Wang Huning, which is a book about kind of triggering a civil war in the United States, which is, I think, a very important book, America Against America. I highly recommend you read it. Thiel is not against government in principle, his friend Auren Hoffman, who is no relation to Reed, says. Auren Hoffman is also an extremely pro-Israel type. So I think it's interesting here. We have two Hoffmans, both of them, very plugged in, okay, in this world. This is Hoffman speaking. The 30s, 40s, and 50s, which had massive, crazy amounts of power, he admires because it was effective. We built the Hoover Dam. We did the Manhattan Project, Hoffman told me. We started the space race. No, 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 no. We did not do any of those things. Okay, I don't believe Hoffman's family was in the United States. I certainly know that Thiel's family was not. Thiel's family was in Nazi Germany, right? They were sort of engaged there. And the people who built the West were people like my namesake, Charles Centennial Carlyle, who lived over there in the western part of the United States. So we did the Manhattan Project. No, Jonathan Buma's grandfather, Legrand Buma, literally that's his name, did the Manhattan Project. He worked on the thing. He got a whole setup there. I think Tom could find it if you search my timeline and you look for Jonathan Buma. You can see the thing he got. Now, we started the space program. Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Who is the we operating there? Is this Operation Paperclip? Who's the we there? And why has Thiel, what's really going on with Thiel and all of that? I think it's a very important point. Yeah, thanks, Tom. When I mention these things, Tom's pretty good about putting it up in the Jumbotron. Okay, but the days when great men could achieve great things in government are gone, Thiel believes. Are they? I don't know. Is the Inflation Reduction Act a great thing? I don't know. We'll think about this. He disdains what the federal apparatus has become: rule bound, stifling of innovation, a quote, senile center left regime. Maybe. It's hard to see that, though, in the form of, AOC out there, or Congressman Gates, young, energetic. It's hard to see that in the form of Lena Khan at the FTC. His libertarian critique of American government has curdled into an almost nihilistic impulse to demolish it. Quote, this is Thiel, "Make America great again" was the most pessimistic slogan of any candidate in 100 years, because you were saying that we are no longer a great country, Thiel told me. And that was a shocking slogan for a major presidential candidate. He thought people needed to hear it. Thiel gave 1.25 million to the Trump campaign and had an office in the Trump Tower during the transition. Okay. Um, and had an office in the Trump Tower during the transition, where he suggested candidates for jobs in the incoming administration. His protege, Michael Kratsios, was named chief technology officer, but few of Thiel's other candidates got jobs. Voting for Trump was like a very not very articulate scream for help, Thiel told me. He fantasized that Trump's election would somehow force a national reckoning. He believed someone needed to tear things down, slash regulations, crush the administrative state before the country could rebuild. He admits now that it was a bad bet. Now, I think it's important here to understand what happened. Thiel did not defend those of us that were Israeli skeptics on the transition. And Thiel very much wanted some of his friends in certain positions within the government and some of his allies, not necessarily the best candidates. And I think that's important as well. Kratsios doesn't really have a science or technology background, say, right? So he's being made chief technology officer. Why? What's the point of that? Maybe he's seeing a lot of things that the government has, right? Maybe they're trying to raid the government of steal technology from it rather than actually think about this more thoroughly. Quote, this is Thiel. There are a lot of things I got wrong, he said. It was crazier than I thought. It was more dangerous than I thought. They couldn't get the most basic pieces of the government to work. So I think, that part was maybe worse than even my low expectations. But if supporting Trump was a gamble, Thiel told me, it's not one he regrets. Interesting. We're going to put a pin in that. I think it's interesting to note that this idea that they couldn't get the most basic pieces of the government to work, maybe there's something kind of more interesting going on here, right? Maybe there's something more fundamental going on here. Maybe the government is working quite well. Maybe it's checking the ability of billionaires and others to raid the government and sort of take it over. Maybe what was going on is that there were lots of people, myself and others included, that were operating, that were doing what we could in the situation in which we found ourselves to stop a lot of the foreign espionage and a lot of the other bad behavior that was going on there. Now, I should note too, I want to make it very clear that I don't really hate any of the people who are involved in this story, right? I want to use it as a way of talking about larger things that are going on in the country and the ways in which we might take a lot of these oligarchs and turn them into knights, right? Because obviously we're the United States of America. We're not going to jack maw anybody, though maybe we should. I mean, that's a sort of subject for another time. And we're certainly not going to bring back the guillotine à la française, right? Like that's not really our style as Americans, and nor should it be. I think what we can do, what makes America a really wonderful country, um, one of the things that I think makes America a really wonderful country is our ability to uh, to turn people, to give people second, third, fourth, even fourth chances, right? I mean, what is Florida if not a land of second, third, and fourth chances, as Congressman Matt Gaetz once put it? So, all right, we're going to continue. We're gonna press on here. Okay. Da, da, da. Some of this is biographical, so you'll forgive me if I just sort of dance over it. Reid Hoffman. So Hoffman here, it's important to note that Hoffman is a Biden supporter, right? Um, Hoffman, he's on the board. Remember, there's this relationship that Hoffman has with Epstein, and Hoffman is very interested in flying, robo cars. He's involved in all kinds of strange technology, and he has himself all these connections with Airbnb. I believe he was on the board there. Airbnb, of course, driving up housing costs for millennials, making it harder for people to own things. Though lots of ties with the Chinese, lots of ties with the Japanese as well. I believe there was one guy, Joy Ito, that he was very connected to, who was also connected to Epstein. All right. Um, Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. All right. And by the way, people are doing the Ancestry, the genie.com stuff, all of that, newspapers.com. All of that stuff is really important. I've written about, if you go to my Substack and search Thiel, you'll see some of the stuff that I put out. I think all of this stuff is very important. Thiel's relationship with Sullivan Cromwell, which was short, is the deep state law firm. He was there very briefly. His relationship with Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse, of course, ties in with the Russians in all these ways. So there's a lot of connections here with Thiel in this world. Okay. And by the way, I want to see Thiel and Thiel's network turned, cleaned up, turned in the service of the United States. And I think that part of the reason I'm so public about a lot of these issues is to sort of force this debate, force this conversation. And I want to force this conversation because I think that while we can invest in the latest and greatest military, we can invest and all this cool shit, rockets, right, submarines, all the shit that like I've personally put money into, it will all be for naught if we don't actually educate the public about what's going on, if we don't think seriously about counterintelligence and how we might deter espionage, capture spies, all that good stuff. Okay, fine. Reid Hoffman, or blah, blah, blah. All right. Time after time, Thiel would espouse grandiose utopian hopes that failed to materialize, leaving him kind of furious or angry. This is Hoffman, kind of furious or angry about the world's unwillingness to bend to whatever vision was possessing him at the moment. Peter tends to be not glasses half empty, but glasses fully empty, Hoffman told me. Disillusionment was a recurring theme in my conversations with Thiel. He is worth between 4 billion and 9 billion. He lives with his husband and two children in a glass palace in Bel Air that has 9 bedrooms and a 90-foot infinity pool. He is a titan of Silicon Valley and a conservative kingmaker. Yet he tells the story of his life as a series of disheartening setbacks. Interesting contrast. Let's go on. Born in Germany, the son of a mining engineer, not just any mining engineer, by the way, this is me speaking, by the way, this is son of Klaus Thiel. Klaus Thiel being somebody who was extracting uranium, right? Uranium is used for what? It's used for nuclear weapons, maybe, right? It's used for nuclear energy. Very important. Thiel lived briefly in Southwest Africa, modern day Namibia, as a child, but grew up primarily in Ohio and California. Um, by the way, he also lived for a spell in South Africa, where he went. He was born in Germany. He kind of spent some time in Ohio. His father studied at Case Western University, Case Western Reserve University, and then at some point, I believe it was when Thiel was in his basically in his primary school days, he was in Namibia as well as in regular apartheid South Africa. All right. After graduating from Stanford and then Stanford Law, he worked briefly on the East Coast before heading back to Silicon Valley. Now, a lot of this stuff, by the way, a lot of these stories here, we don't necessarily know how true they are. Things are much more complicated with the origin stories of a lot of these companies. So I want to be very clear about this as we kind of tuck into this stuff. All right. In 1998, Thiel teamed up with Max Levchin, a brilliant computer scientist, and together they founded the company that became PayPal, with the declared purpose of creating a libertarian alternative to government currency. That grand ambition went unfulfilled, but PayPal turned out to be a terrific way to pay for online purchases, which were growing exponentially. In 2002, eBay bought the company for $1.5 billion. Yes, that was Meg Whitman who bought the company back when she was running it. And there's a lot of ways of thinking about this period in the 1990s. My view, for what it's worth, is that PayPal was really about moving money from the former Soviet Union into the United States or from South Africa. There was lots of money, people, information that had to move around in the post-Cold War era. And PayPal was kind of critically important for all of that. And I've written about PayPal elsewhere. Maybe we could do a space on that as well. All right. In 2004, Thiel co-founded Palantir Technologies, a private intelligence firm that does data mining for government and private clients at home and abroad. The CIA's venture capital firm, called In-Q-Tel, was his first outside investor. It's important to note, by the way, that In-Q-Tel was very plugged in with the CIA, but also with the Israeli world. This is very much a post 9/11 era, right? Okay. This was also the year he placed the most celebrated wager in the history of venture capital. He met Mark Zuckerberg, um, He met Mark Zuckerberg, liked what he heard, and became Facebook's first outside investor. $500,000 bought him a 10% stake of the company, most of which he cashed out for about $1 billion in 2012. He came to regret the sale, however, at Facebook's market peak. In 2021, his stake would have been worth many times more. Very important details here. There's sort of lots going on here. We've talked about Facebook before and the constructs and who really ran Facebook, which is, Sheryl Sandberg and her role as Larry Summers' mistress. And there's a lot going on Facebook, and it's sort of beyond the scope of this thing, but we can maybe talk about it at another time. Thiel made some poor investments, losing enormous sums by going long on the stock market in 2008 when it nosedived, and then shorting the market in 2009 when it rallied. But on the whole, he has done exceptionally well. Alex Karp, his Palantir co-founder, who agrees with Thiel on very little other than business, calls him the world's best venture investor. Maybe there's more going on. Okay. Thiel told me this is indeed his ambition, and he hinted that he may have achieved it. But his dreams have always been much, much bigger than that. He longs for a world in which great men are free to work their will on society, unconstrained by government or regulation or, quote, redistributionist economics, end quote, that would impinge on their wealth and power, or any obligation really to the rest of humanity. He longs for radical new technologies and scientific advances on a scale most of us can hardly imagine. He takes for granted that this kind of progress will redound to the benefit of society at large. More than anything, he longs to live forever. Thiel does not believe death is inevitable. Calling death a law of nature is, in his view, just an excuse for giving up. It's something we are told that demotivates us from trying harder, he said. He has spent enormous sums trying to evade his own end, but feels that if anything, he should devote even more time and money to solving the problem of human mortality. Now, there's a lot of bullshit here, okay? So, first is that he longs for a world in which great men are free to work their will on society. That is effectively a definition of fascism, okay? This idea of a kind of Ubermensch, right? These kind of people out there operating. And if you read Thiel's book, Zero to One, he's effectively making an argument for a world filled with monopolies, right? And monopolies, how do monopolies price? Monopolies price equals marginal revenue, not price equals marginal cost. So there's not really competition driving down prices. There's kind of these economic fiefdoms where people are dictating prices to the public. Now, I think it's also worth noting there was a group of people in the post-war period after World War II. People know about Operation Paperclip, right? This is well known. All of the Nazis who were brought to the United States, among them Werner von Braun and other kind of players. But there was another group as well, a group called the Die Hake Network. And Die Hake is very important to understand because Die Hake was all about these German, basically these West German scientists, engineers, industrialists, all of whom basically pretended to be super anti-communist, but who were in fact very much involved with East Germany and had all of these kind of relationships as well. And I think that this is an important thing because it's, Thiel's father and possibly his uncle as well are a part of this network. Now, the other thing to kind of notice too is that a lot of the longevity stuff, right? If you're trying to launder money, right? If you're trying to pay assets, right? You can pay assets in all kinds of interesting ways. And one way you can do that is by having this like really big hard problem, a problem that no one can solve. It's so big, it's so massive. We just have to try harder. Let's just spend more money. Let's just, let's go, man. Let's get it done, right? Yeah, it's Die Hake. It's a space D-I-E, Die Hake, space H-A-K, H-A-C-K-E. And one thing to think about too is that, so we live in a post-World War II era, right? And we also live in a post-Cold War era. And during the post-Cold War, or post-World War II era, there was a kind of effort to basically, obviously to run Germany and to basically force Germany never to be in the position in which it had been during the Nazi Germany period. So there was lots of British spies operating there, especially in a place called Bielefeld, and Bielefeld is actually where Thiel's family lived as well. And there's a lot of interesting research there about Thiel's time in Germany. I've been meaning to kind of do a more serious deep dive on that now that the government has changed to Schultz, because Schultz is kind of more, shall we say, Thiel skeptical. Um, but we can maybe do a whole Germany thing at some point in the future, because I know that there are people here who are also German, fans of this period. But the thing to understand is that, like, for those of you who are comic book fans, Hydra is real, right? Spectre is real. Um, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to discover technologies to basically disrupt the world, right? To basically overturn everything, to make everything go crazy as a way of changing our society. So they're not terribly interested in making the state more efficient or making the state live up to its promises. No, au contraire, they're interested in hollowing out the state. So if you live in an era in which the CIA doesn't work all that well, you'll build Palantir. If NASA doesn't work all that well, you'll build SpaceX. Now, I myself am a government contractor. I've invested and built several companies. One of which, Clearview AI, basically stole all the photos off of the internet with the purpose of making people safer. And I had Thiel as an investor on that because I wanted to break Facebook and sort of deal with the exploitative nature of Facebook and nationalize those photos. So that's kind of a larger kind of thing. All right. Thiel grew up reading a great deal of science fiction and fantasy. Heinlein, Asimov, Clarke, but especially Tolkien. He has said that he read the Lord of the Rings trilogy at least 10 times. But did he understand it? Tolkien's influences on his worldview is obvious. Middle Earth is an arena of struggle for ultimate power, largely without government, where extraordinary individuals rise to fulfill their destinies. Also, there are immortal elves who live apart from men in a magical sheltered valley. Okay? Now, Heinlein, Asimov, and Clarke are all very interesting figures. Heinlein is from a Navy family. In fact, my grandfather, who was a rear admiral, actually knew Heinlein socially, for what it's worth. Dwight Lyman Johnson, you could look him up. He won the Navy Cross and was involved in naval intelligence work. Asimov was kind of a more Refusenik Jew avant la lettre, sort of before the Refusenik period. And Clarke, it's pretty clear that Clarke was, in addition to being a pedophile, or at least, shall we say, interested in young boys, Clarke was also very tied in with MI6. And he sort of spent the waning years of his life living in Sri Lanka, where he sort of lived. And he had a relationship with Rupert Murdoch. He had a relationship with kind of keeping an eye on India on behalf of the British government. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. And one thing to understand is that when America was basically building up and trying to catch up to the Soviet Union in the post-war era, um, one thing to kind of understand in this period is that there was a kind of propaganda campaign by the US deep state to kind of encourage largely young men, but some young women, into pursuing careers in science. Tolkien is more interesting. Tolkien kind of comes out of Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. He comes out of the British deep state world. Tolkien is a translator. Tolkien is working on various problems both in the World War One, after World War One, and into World War Two. And Tolkien is a very, very fascinating figure. He's somebody that we should maybe do a space on in its own right. One of the companies that I backed, a company called Othram. Othram is the wall from Lord of the Rings. It's the company running around solving all those murders and rapes using genomic genealogy. And it's also a company that Thiel refused to back. Okay, so it's something that strengthens the power of the state. Okay, now my view of the Lord of the Rings series is actually on the contrary, that there's extraordinary individuals rise to fulfill their destinies. Au contraire, it's the hobbits, it's the regular folk, the folk from the Shire who are called upon to do extraordinary things, and their love of each other and of their home is what ultimately gets them to work together to destroy the ring. Okay. By the way, I've stayed at Thiel's home in New Zealand for what it's worth. And there's like all kinds of Lord of the Rings shit there, which is kind of interesting in its own right. All right. Did his dream of eternal life trace to the Lord of Rings? I wondered. Yes, Thiel said, perking up. There are all these ways where trying to live unnaturally goes haywire in Tolkien's works. But you also have elves. And then there are all sorts of all these questions. How are the elves different from the humans in Tolkien? And they're basically, I think, the main difference is just they're humans that don't die. So why can't we be elves? I asked Thiel. Thiel nodded reverently, his expression a blend of hope and chagrin. Why can't we be elves? He said. All right. Now, there is this desire that people have to live for forever, right? But the ancients kind of understood that there were three ways to live forever. The first, accessible to most of us, is to have children, right? Which many of us are parents, fathers, mothers, what have you. And this is a way we can connect ourselves to this greater world. Like we know we're going to die. And so when we have children, we connect ourselves to this larger possibility, this larger future, just as our parents did before us and their parents before them. The second way is studying the forms, right? And this is like being a world class cellist, being a world class, basically being a saint, right? If you want to use the Catholic analogy, these are people who kind of touch the eternal by doing and studying the forms, the great kind of poetry, the kind of like Platonic ideal of the chair or of the horse. Think of it like your professor type. The third type, and I think this is the type that Thiel is really after, is the type that wants to overthrow the world, right? That wants to, as Lincoln talks about it, the men of the tribe of the lion and the eagle, right? Lincoln talks about how there's this sort of Napoleonic complex. These people who want to conquer everything, these people who would, enslave the world or free the world. They're sort of these are your Alexander the Greats, your Napoleons, your Hitlers, right? Your Stalins, right? And there are people who their very name conjures a kind of attempt to take over the world. And I think this is what is really going on. I think that this desire to live for forever, if you have a network of people, and let's face it, many of the people in the Thiel verse are they draft off of his career, right? This is very important to them. And in particular, many of them come out of the Stanford Review. And we're going to get into the Stanford Review in a second and kind of what all that's about, the kind of identification of highly intelligent people that are dissatisfied with the world, right? And how those people might be recruited by foreign intelligence or by others to kind of upset the domestic tranquility in the United States. All right, let's continue. Thiel's abandonment of Trump is not the first time he has decided to step away from politics. During college, he co founded the Stanford Review, gleefully throwing bombs at identity politics and the university's diversity minded reform of curriculum. He co wrote The Diversity Myth in 1995, a treatise against what he recently called quote, the craziness and silliness and stupidity of the wickedness of the left. By the way, he signed a copy of that book and he wrote, "We will bury them," underlining it, which is, of course, what Nikita Khrushchev said during the Cold War. So I've always wondered about what he was saying there when he gave that to me. And The Diversity Myth, by the way, was published by the Independent Institute, which is a kind of like crazy libertarian outfit in the Bay Area. And he co-wrote it with David Sachs. David Sachs of PayPal fame, who sort of co-founded PayPal who was not co-founded it, but he was one of the early PayPal people. And David Sachs is also involved with Locals and Rumble, which are, these sort of Israeli Likudnik properties. And Sachs married a woman, Jacqueline. I forget how you say her last name. It's like Tortorini. It's some Italian name. I'll butcher it. Good heavens! But who's his father-in-law is kind of connected with the Italian mob. And I want you to kind of think about that when you think about David Sachs and all the weird stuff he's been up to. All right. As he built his companies and grew rich, this is Gallman writing, he began pouring money into political causes and candidates. Libertarian groups such as Endorse Liberty Super PAC, in addition to a wide range of conservative Republicans, including Senators Orrin Hatch and Ted Cruz and the Anti Tax Club for Growth Super PAC. Now, Orrin Hatch is very, very Mormon. That's sort of useful to keep in mind. And Ted Cruz is, of course, tied into all kinds of weird networks, very involved in Texas. I've known Ted Cruz a long time, too. In fact, there's a photo out there floating around on the internet of my then wife and me and Ted Cruz, I think from like 2010 or 2012. And the Anti Tax Club for Growth Super PAC, which has all of its ties with the Chinese. But something changed for Thiel in 2009, the first of several swings of his political pendulum. That year, he wrote a manifesto titled The Education of a Libertarian, in which he disavowed electoral politics as a vehicle for reshaping society. The people, he concluded, could not be trusted with important decisions. I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible, he wrote. It was a striking declaration, and an even more notable one followed. Since 1920, the vast increase in welfare benefits and the extension of the franchise to women, two constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, have rendered the notion of a capitalist democracy into an oxymoron. He elaborated after some backlash that he did not literally oppose women's suffrage, but neither did he affirm his support for it. Thiel laid out a plan for himself and others, quote, to find an escape from politics in all its forms, end quote. He wanted to create new spaces for personal freedom that governments could not reach, spheres where the choices of one great man could still be paramount. The fate of our world may depend on the effort of a single person who builds or propagates the machinery of freedom, he wrote. Interesting quote. I don't know that I'd necessarily disagree with that. I think that that's important. But maybe we should be working to a world in which we don't need to rely on one person. And what is the machinery of freedom anyway? Freedom to do what? Freedom to enslave others? Freedom to, what does that mean, freedom? I think it means something very different to the son of the American Revolution or the son of, the sort of German world, right? His manifesto has since become legendary in Silicon Valley, where his worldview is shaped by other powerful men and men hoping to be Peter Thiel. Interesting. Thiel's investment in cryptocurrency, like the founding vision at PayPal, aimed to foster a new kind of money, quote, free from all government control and dilution, end quote. His decision to rescue Musk's struggling SpaceX in 2008 with a $20 million infusion that kept the company alive after 3 botched rocket launches came with aspirations to promote space as an open frontier with, quote, limitless possibility for escape from a world of politics. I tried to reach Musk at X requesting an interview, but got a poop emoji in response. Yeah, that's about right. Musk, has all these other problems that we can get into, we may get into in a subsequent space. I think it's important to note Musk basically ultimately was rescued by the US taxpayer, right? By NASA, by the military industrial place, which wants to control space in the way that the United States, controls the seas, right? It's a way of basically taking satellites, looking down, peering down on the earth, all of things that I've invested in for what it's worth. It was seasteading that became Thiel's greatest philanthropic cause in the late aughts and early 2010s. The idea was to create autonomous microstates on platforms in international waters. This, Thiel believed, was a more realistic path toward functioning libertarian spaces in the short term than colonizing space. So basically, he wants pirates, okay? And pirates, what do you do with pirates? You hang them. He gave substantial sums to Patry Friedman, the grandson of the economist Milton Friedman, to establish the nonprofit Seasteading Institute. I want you to think about what this op might do, right? If you're trying to balkanize countries or you're trying to create all these independent city states, sure, that might be a super free libertarian place, but it might also be a place where all kinds of illegal activity could take place. It might also be a place that could get dominated by other international players like, say, the Chinese, right? Who The U.S. is contending for influence in the Pacific. All right.
Wasn't Ghislaine Maxwell involved with that as
I
well,
don't
Charles?
know. I don't know. That's a good question. We might need a fact check on that.
I'll look for that and I'll find something. I'll post it.
All right. I did write something about Patry Friedman and Milton Friedman, Thomas, if you want to put that up in the Jumbotron. I did write something on my Substack about this at one point. Thiel told a room full of believers at an institute conference in 2009 that most people don't think seasteading is possible and therefore will therefore not interfere until it's too late. The question of whether seasteading is desirable or possible, in my mind, is not even relevant, he said. It is absolutely necessary. That's interesting. Engineering challenges aside, Max Levchin, his friend and PayPal co founder, dismissed the idea that Thiel would ever actually move to one of those specks in the sea. Quote, there's zero chance Peter Thiel would live on sea land, he said, noting that Thiel likes his comforts too much. Thiel has mansions around the world and a private jet. Thiel performed at his 2017 wedding at the Belvedere Museum in Vienna. By 2015, 6 years after declaring his intent to change the world, by the way, Vienna is where the German world, the Russian world, all kind of intersect, and the oil world all intersect. By 2015, 6 years after declaring his intent to change the world from the private sector, Thiel began having second thoughts. He cut off funding for the Seasteading Institute. Years of talk had yielded no practical progress and turned to other forms of escape. Maybe the op was already paid for. Maybe he was actually using seasteading to pay the network around Patry Friedman and was less interested in actual seasteading. He already had German and American citizenship, but he invested millions of dollars in New Zealand and obtained citizenship there in 2011. He bought a former sheep station on 477 acres in the lightly populated South Island that had the makings of an end times retreat in a country where the Lord of the Rings films were shot. Sam Altman, the former venture capitalist and now CEO of OpenAI, revealed in 2016 that in the event of a global catastrophe, he and Thiel plan to wait it out in Thiel's New Zealand hideaway. When I asked Thiel about that scenario, he seemed embarrassed and deflected the question. He did not remember the arrangement as Altman did, he said. Even framing it that way, though, makes it sound ridiculous. He said, if there is a real end of the world, there is no place to go. Okay, interesting, maybe. Or maybe it's good to have an island or someplace. Maybe it's also a place where you can access all sorts of other players. Who's to say? I don't know. Over and over, Thiel has voiced his discontent with what's become of the grand dreams of science fiction in the mid 20th century. We'd have colonies on the moon, you'd have robots, you'd have flying cars, you'd have cities in the ocean, under the ocean, he said in the Seasteading Institute keynote. You'd have eco farming. You'd turn the deserts into arable land. There were sorts of all these incredible things that people thought would happen in the 50s and 60s, and they would sort of transform the world. None of that came to pass. Even science fiction turned hopeless. Nowadays, you get nothing but dystopias. The tech boom brought us the iPhone and Uber and social media, none of them a fundamental improvement to the human condition. He hungered for advances in the world of atoms, not the world of bits. For a time, Thiel thought he knew how to set things right. Founders Fund, the venture capital firm he established in 2005 with Luke Nozick and Ken Howry, published a manifesto that complained, we wanted flying cars. We wanted flying cars. Instead, we got 140 characters. Of course, instead we got STEMcentrics, which was a kind of money laundering fraud that was a tech company that Thiel invested in. The fund, therefore, would invest in smart people solving hard problems that really have the potential to change the world. Yeah, I don't believe this, by the way, just for what it's worth. This is Charles speaking. I think there's a lot more fraud going on there than at Founders Fund than we're sort of allowed to talk about. But We'll get into that maybe. I joined Thiel one recent Tuesday afternoon for a video conference to review a pair of startups in his portfolio. In his little box on the Zoom screen, he looked bored. Daniel Yu, connecting from Zanzibar, okay, note that surname, Yu, Y-U, connecting from Zanzibar, made a short, lucid presentation. His company, Wazako, was an e-commerce platform for mom and pop stores in Africa, supplying shopkeepers with rice, soap, toilet paper, and other basics. Africa is the fastest urbanizing region in the world, and Wasoko's gross margin had doubled since last year. Tia was looking down at his briefing papers. He read something about Wasoko becoming the Alibaba of Africa, pet peeve. Anything that's the something of somewhere is the nothing of nowhere. Very interesting, he said a little sourly. So this is me. This is me speaking. By the way, notice the Chinese kind of penetration there of Africa. Alibaba is a Chinese firm, right? Let's continue. Next up was a company called Leica Masocatas in Bogota. Someone on the call described it as the Chewy of Latin America. Thiel frowned. The company delivered pet supplies directly to the homes of consumers. It had quadrupled its revenue every year for 3 years. The CEO, Camilo Sanchez Villamarin, walked through the numbers. Thiel thanked him and signed off. This was not what Thiel wanted to be doing with his time. Bogotas and dog food were making him money, apparently, but he had set out to invest in transformational technologies that would advance the state of human civilization. And yet, Thiel doesn't seem to invest in certain things, does he? It's sort of interesting to pay attention to. This is Charles speaking again. The trouble is not exactly that Thiel's portfolio is pedestrian or uninspiring. Founders Fund has holdings in artificial intelligence, biotech, space exploration, and other cutting edge fields. What bothers Thiel is that his companies are not taking up big swings at big problems, or that they are striking out. It was harder than it looked, Thiel said. I'm not actually involved in enough companies that are growing a lot, that are taking our civilization to the next level. Because you couldn't find those companies, I asked. I couldn't find them, he said. I couldn't get enough of them to work. Now, this is just not true, okay? Many of the companies that I brought to Thiel are growing and are tremendously large companies now. These include Othram, they include, Clearview AI. The problem is that Founders Fund is deeply compromised. Whether that's Keith Rabois, who, credibly is accused of sexually assaulting people, certainly sexually harassing them, and has all these ties with Netanyahu in his network, or whether it's Delian, however you say the guy's last name, who's engaged in a kind of fraud there. The problem is that Thiel doesn't want to do the hard work of having real, serious people around him because he's not actually a free agent. And we'll get into kind of why in just a second. But we're going to move into the Russian sphere here. There's a lot more here, by the way. All right. In 2018, a Russian named Daniil Bislinger handed Thiel his business card. The card described him uh, as a foreign service officer. Thiel understood otherwise. He believed that Bissinger was an intelligence officer with the FSB, the successor to the Soviet KGB. A U.S. intelligence officer later told me Thiel was right. The Russian embassy in Berlin, where Bissinger had been based, did not respond to questions about him. Yeah, no shit. Thiel received an invitation that day and then again in January 2022 to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. No agenda was specified. Thiel had been fascinated by Putin's czar-like presence in a room in Davos years before, all champagne and caviar, and you had a sort of this gaggle of, I don't know, mafia-like looking oligarchs standing around him, he recalled. But he did not make the trip. Instead, he reported the contact to the FBI, for which Thiel had become a confidential human source, codenamed Philosopher. Thiel's role as an FBI informant, first reported by Insider, dated back to May 2021. Charles Johnson, that's me, a tech investor, right-wing attention troll, that's not me, I'm not right-wing, and longtime associate of Thiel's, told me he himself had become an FBI informant some time ago. Johnson introduced Thiel to FBI Special Agent Jonathan Buma. A source with close knowledge of the relationship said Buma told Thiel that he did not want to know about Thiel's contacts with U.S. elected officials or public figures, which were beyond the FBI's investigative interests. Buma saw his interaction with Thiel, this source said, as a strictly counterintelligence, anti influence operation directed at foreign governments. Thiel responded to my questions about his relationship with a terse no comment. A close a close associate, speaking with Thiel's permission, said, quote, "It would be strange if Peter had never met with people from the deep state, including three-letter agencies, especially given the fact that he founded Palantir 20 years ago." Johnson told me he has a reputation as a right-wing agitator. He said that he had fostered that image in order to gather information for the FBI and other government agencies. He said he is now a supporter of President Joe Biden. Woot woot. That's just me speaking. I recognize that I'm an imperfect messenger, he said. He told me a great many things about Thiel and others that I could not verify. But knowledgeable sources confirmed his role in recruiting Thiel for Buma. He and Thiel have since fallen out. "We are taking a permanent break from one another," Thiel texted Johnson about a year ago, "starting now." In fact, he actually sent me an email wanting to meet again, which I did not know if I gave that to Gelman or not. For what it's worth, it's me that doesn't want a relationship with Thiel. I think that Thiel has a passing familiarity with ethics and integrity and doesn't love the United States the way I do. It's not really his country, right? I mean, he's a Maltese, Kiwi, German, God knows what else, citizen. And so, I look at it just very differently. This is my home. My family has been here for 400 years. It's where I intend to die. And it's where I intend to live. So, there's just a difference there. And at least 20 hours of logged face to face meetings with Buma, Thiel reported on what he believed to be a Chinese effort to take over a large venture capital firm, cough, cough, Sequoia, discussed Russian involvement in Silicon Valley, but presumably not his own firm, and suggested that Jeffrey Epstein, a man he had met several times, was an Israeli intelligence operative. Uh, Thiel told me he thinks Epstein was probably entangled with Israeli military intelligence, but was more involved with the U.S. deep state. Interesting, interesting. By the way, that's my view as well. My view is that Epstein died serving the United States of America. Um, Buma, according to a source who has seen his reports, once asked Thiel why some of the extremely rich seem so open to contacts with foreign governments, and he said that they're bored. This source said they're bored, and I actually believe it. I think it's that simple. I think they're just bored billionaires. Oh, come on. This is me speaking, by the way. Give me a fucking break. It's because they're compromised. It's because they want access to the money, to the intelligence services. It's because they want to be constructs, because they want to live the good life, and basically they like to middleman between these different countries. All right. We're about finished with this, and then we can kind of go into this. By the way, I don't know how many people are in this space because I haven't really checked, but oh wow, quite a number of people actually. Welcome everyone. I don't know if that's if this is helpful at all, but we're kind of going to continue going here. And by the way, um, one of the reasons I have been speaking about these things publicly um, is I think we're in a moment where we have an obligation to talk about this stuff and where we need to just stop like with the bullshit, stop with the lies. Um, we need to start just exposing this stuff and making it very public. Who knows who where? And we need counterintelligence to protect our billionaires, to protect the people in our country who might get compromised, might get targeted by these different intelligence networks, these different mafia operations. Um, and I think, by the way, I mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again because I think it's important. When the piece came out, and Thomas, if you would be so kind as to share this one as well. Um, when the piece came out, I wrote a piece about my so-called extracurricular activities. And yeah, on my extracurricular activities, the Business Insider Teal story and Founders Fund. This is the October 19th piece. And I have a piece up there about why I did what I did in terms of coming forward and all that. And there's this piece, this part here. All right, this is what I wrote at the time. The recent revelations that Elon Musk stopped a military advance that would have ended the Ukrainian war earlier really offended me. The Russian use of food as a weapon is a war crime, and several of my portfolio companies and friends are deployed in Ukraine. Jonathan Buma and I stopped Elon Musk from giving billions in inflated stock to Igor Kurganov, a Russian poker player backed by the Chinese mob. We leaked that information to then Wall Street Journal reporter Rob Copeland, though he left out the Chinese mob stuff. Copeland, by the way, has since decamped for the New York Times, and he's written a pretty good book about Ray Dalio. From my understanding of it, I'm about a quarter of the way through it, and I may have to buy it again because I spilled a bunch of Coca-Cola on it, and it like is sticky and gross. Um, make sure you're not as clumsy as I am, dear listeners. The news of Elon Musk's ties to the Ukrainian mob and to Russian intelligence has made me convinced we did not do enough. Founders Fund has continued to back a series of con men rather than be a responsible venture fund firm, including leading a round into Neuralink. Either Peter Thiel is unable or unwilling to fix this problem at Founders Fund. All right, that's what I said at the time. All right, let's continue. Let's go back to where we were. Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Let's see here. Da-da-da-da. 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 Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. All right. By the way, Bellman asked me if the relationship with Thiel was severed, and I said, no. I mean, look, I have nothing against people serving other countries, right? I have nothing against people. Um, I'm not a hater, right? Like people have their views of me, and I actually spend a lot of my time meeting with people who are the damned, the depressed, the suicidal. Um, partly this is I do this because it's very interesting. It's very interesting work, and I also do it because I think it's what God calls me to do. And I know not everybody in this space is religious, and I'm not here. I'm no preacher. I'm not here to like force people to do certain things. But for me, I've found that we have to keep the soul in the technology world. We have to keep the soul in the finance world, and we have to make sure that we don't become basically consumed with these kind of materialistic possessions or this obsession with living for forever, that we don't actually live in the here and now, and we don't do what we can. So all right, let's continue. Da 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 da. Let's see. Oh, good heavens, we still have a lot more to go. All right. Uh, all right. In Thiel's um, all right. In Thiel's Los Angeles office, he has a sculpture that resembles a three-dimensional game board. Ascent, above the nation-state board game display prototype, is the New Zealander artist Simon Denny's attempt to map Thiel's ideological universe. The board features a landscape in yeah, maybe we'll do two parts. No, Thomas, we're almost finished. We'll soldier on. We have a good maybe 30, 40 minutes left in us. All right, don't worry, Thomas. The board features a landscape in the aesthetic of Dungeons and Dragons, thick with monsters and knights and castles. The monsters include an ogre labeled monetary policy. Near the center is a hero figure, recognizable as Teal. He tilts against a lion and a dragon, holding a shield and longbow. The lion is labeled fair elections. The dragon is labeled democracy. The Teal figure is trying to kill them. Good Lord. My goodness. Thiel saw this sculpture at a gallery in Auckland in December 2017. He loved the piece, preserving it, he told me, as sympathetic to roughly my side of the political spectrum. In fact, the artist intended it as a critique. At the same show, he bought a portrait of his friend Curtis Yarvin, an explicitly anti democratic writer who calls for a strong armed leader to govern the United States as a monarch. Thiel gave the painting to Yarvin as a gift. When I asked Thiel to explain his views on democracy, he dodged the question. I always wonder whether people like you use the word democracy when you like the results people have, and use the word populism when you don't like the results, he told me. If I'm characterized as more pro populist than the elitist Atlantic is, then in that sense, I'm more pro democratic. This felt like a debater's riposte. I think that's how you said it, riposte. Not to be taken seriously. He had given a more honest answer before that. He told me that he no longer dwells on democracy's flaws because he believes we Americans don't have one. We are not a democracy. We're a republic, he said. We're not even a republic. We're a constitutional republic. What do you mean we? Kiwi, Maltese, German. He said he has no wish to change the American form of government, and then amended himself. Oh, I don't think it's realistic for it to be radically changed, which is not at all the same thing. When I asked what he thinks of Yarvin's autocratic agenda, Thiel offered objections that sounded not so much principled as practical. I don't think it's going to work. I think it will look like Xi in China or Putin in Russia, Thiel said, meaning a malign dictatorship. It ultimately, I don't think, will even be accelerationist on the science and technology side, to say nothing of what it will do for individual rights, individual liberties, things of that sort. Still, Thiel considers Yarvin an interesting and powerful historian. By the way, Yarvin is not trained as a historian, but whatever. One of the big things that he always talks about is the New Deal and FDR in the 1930s and 1940s, Thiel said. And the heterodox take is that it was a sort of light form of fascism in the United States. This is not, by the way, my view at all. FDR was related to my family and was a kind of WASP, noblesse oblige type who was crippled by polio but had a real vision of the United States and was very connected with what we might call the Anglo-American British deep state. And there's a great discussion of FDR in this thing called The Room. There's a discussion about his group of informal WASPs around the world that sort of served FDR and sort of waspish Jews, because in those days the Jews wanted to be more waspy than the wasps did. And if you search my Twitter stream and you search The Room, you'll pull it up, and maybe we can share that with the group. All right. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in this reading of history, used a domineering view of executive authority, a compliant Congress, and an intimidated Supreme Court to force what Thiel called very, very drastic changes in the nature of our society. Yarvin, Thiel said, argues that you should embrace this sort of light form of fascism, and we should have a president who's like FDR again. Really? They're going to grow the social welfare safety net? Is that really what Yarvin is going for? No. What he's trying to do is he's trying to have an anti-FDR. It would be hard to find an academic historian to endorse that view, the view that fascism, light or otherwise, accounted for Roosevelt's presidential power, indeed. But I was interested in something else. Did Thiel agree with Yarvin's vision of fascism as a desirable governing model? Again, he dodged the question. That's not a realistic political program, he said, refusing to be drawn any further. Mhm. Looking back on Trump's years in office, Thiel walked a careful line. He was disenchanted with the former president, who did not turn out to be the revolutionary Thiel had hoped he might be. A number of things were said and done that Thiel did not approve of. Mistakes were made, but Thiel was not going to refashion himself as a never Trumper in retrospect. The first time Thiel and I spoke, I asked about the nature of his disappointment. Later, he referred back to that question in a way that suggested he felt constrained. I have to somehow give the exact right answer, where it's like, yeah, I'm somewhat disenchanted, he told me. But throwing him totally under the bus, that's like, I'll get yelled at by Mr. Trump. And if I don't throw him under the bus, yeah, but somehow I have to get the tone exactly right. Discouraged by Trump's performance, Thiel had quietly stepped aside in the 2020 election. He wrote no check to the second Trump campaign and said little or nothing about it in public. He had not made any grand resolution to stay out. He just wasn't moved to get in. Thiel knew, because he had read some of my previous work, that I think Trump's gravest offense against the republic was his attempt to overthrow the election. I asked how he thought about it. Look, I don't think the election was stolen, he said, But then he tried to turn the discussion to past elections that might have been wrongly decided. Bush Gore in 2000, for instance. Thiel thought Gore was probably the rightful victor. Before that, he'd started on a riff about Nixon Kennedy, or Kennedy Nixon. He came back to Trump's attempt to prevent the transfer of power. I'll agree with you that it was not helpful, he said. I'll bet. By the way, my company, Clearview AI, was used that day to catch, turn, and stop thousands of people, many of whom mentally ill, but some of whom spies, and to identify them using facial recognition. And so I think a lot about that period of January 6th when, because I had set up this company, a company that Thiel had promised to fund and which he ultimately barely funded and which he sort of helped but then didn't help. I think a lot about how different things would be if we didn't have all that technology. All right, let's continue. Trump's lies about the election were, however, a big issue in last year's midterms. Yeah, no kidding. Thiel was a major donor to J.D. Vance, who won his Senate race in Ohio, and Blake Masters, who lost in Arizona. Both ran as election deniers, as did many of the other House and Senate candidates Thiel funded that year. Thiel expressed no anxiety about their commitment to election denial. But now, heading into 2024, he was getting out of politics again. Beyond his disappointment with Trump, there is another piece of the story, which Thiel reluctantly agreed to discuss. In July, Puck reported that Democratic operatives have been digging for dirt on Thiel since before the 2022 elections, conducting opposition research into his personal life with the express purpose of driving him out of politics. The reported leaders of the Oppo campaign did not respond to my questions. By the way, the real story is that the US deep state forced Thiel out. And I was involved in that process, and I'm quite proud of it. Among other things, the operatives are said to have interviewed a young model named Jeff Thomas, who told them he was having an affair with Thiel and encouraged Thomas to talk to Ryan Grim, a reporter for The Intercept. Grimm did not publish the story during election season, as the opposition researchers hoped he would, but he wrote about Thiel's affair in March after Thomas died by suicide. Thiel declined to comment on Thomas's death, citing the family's request for privacy. He deplored the dirt digging operation, telling me in an email that the nihilism affecting American politics is even deeper than I knew. He also seemed bewildered by the passions he arouses on the left. I don't think they should hate me this much, he said. By the way, Thiel put his lover, Jeff Thomas, in a property that was owned by the Nexium cult. And the Nexium cult was quite close to a guy by the name of Thor Halvorsen, who Thiel knew socially, and I think they may still even be close. And Thor Halvorsen, when I was 22, tried to rape me in a hotel room. And Thiel continued to be associated with this man, even after I told him about all of this. So just think about that and think about the Nexium connection there, because I think it's an important one. On the last Thursday in April, Thiel stood in a ballroom at the Metropolitan Club, one of New York's finest Gilded Age buildings. Decorative marble fireplaces accented the intricate panelwork in burgundy and gold, all beneath Renaissance-style ceiling murals. What a line, Mr. Gilman. Well done. Thiel had come to receive an award from the New Criterion, a conservative publication magazine of literature and politics, and to bask in the attention of nearly 300 fans. These were Thiel's people, and he spoke at the closed press event with a lot less nuance than he had in our interviews. His after-dinner remarks were full of easy applause lines and in-jokes mocking the left. Universities had become intellectual wastelands, obsessed with a meaningless quest for diversity, he told the crowd. The humanities writ large are transparently ridiculous, said the one-time philosophy major. By the way, as we mentioned earlier, his codename was Philosopher. And there's no real science going on in the sciences, which have devolved into the enforcement of very curious dogmas. Thiel reprised his long-standing critique of the diversity myth. He made a plausible point about the ideological monoculture of the DEI industry. You don't have real diversity, he said, with people who look different but talk and think alike. Then he made a crack that seemed more revealing. Diversity, it's not It's not enough to just hire the extras from the space cantina scene in Star Wars, he said, prompting laughter. By the way, I should note there's not a lot of diversity in any of Thiel's operations. It's worth paying attention to that. No ideological diversity, no real commitment. No, there's certainly no pro-Palestine person that works at Founders Fund, right? So just think about that. There's a kind of monoculture there of people going to quote unquote the right schools and having the right ideas. Okay, let's continue. Diversity, it's not enough to just hire order. Okay. Nor did Thiel say what genuine diversity would mean. Yeah, indeed. The quest for it, he said, is very evil and it's very silly. Evil, he explained, because the silliness is distracting us from very important things, such as threats to U.S. interests posed by the Chinese Communist Party. His closing, which used the same logic, earned a standing ovation. When someone says DEI, he exhorted the crowd, just think CCP. Worth paying attention to this. Thiel's relationship has all these other relationships with the Chinese. Remember, the money that goes to Founders Fund comes from KKR, which gets its money in turn from China. Okay, worth paying attention to. Somebody asked in the Q&A portion of the evening whether Thiel thought the woke left was deliberately advancing Chinese communist interests. Thiel answered with an unprompted jab at a fellow billionaire. It's always the difference between an agent and an asset. And an agent is someone who is working for the enemy in full mens rea. An asset is a useful idiot. So even if you ask the question, is Bill Gates China top ass agent or top asset in the US? Here the crowd started roaring. Does it really make a difference? Does it indeed, Peter? Are you an asset or are you an agent? Something to think about. Thiel sometimes uses Gates as a foil in his public remarks. So I asked him what he thought of the Giving Pledge, the campaign Gates conceived in 2010 with his then wife, Melinda French Gates, and Warren Buffett, uh, to persuade billionaires to give away more than half their wealth to charitable causes. Disclosure, one of my sons works for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Oh dear. Oh dear, Mr. Gelman. Worth paying attention to what all that money is used for. About 10 years ago, Thiel told me, a fellow venture capitalist called to broach the question. Vinod Khosla, a co-founder of Sun Microsystems. By the way, I've written about Khosla before. Khosla was involved in Square, which is a money laundering front. He's been involved in all kinds of interesting projects. Khosla's family are all Indian intelligence and Indian military officers. So there's a very interesting question about whether he is. Had made the Giving Pledge a couple of years before. Would Thiel be willing to talk with Gates about doing the same? By the way, one thing to kind of understand is that a lot of these billionaires, they do the Giving Pledge or they create these foundations, but the US deep state doesn't really run the foundations. The foundations end up being run by sort of deeply compromised individuals, and they're kind of slush funds for running ops and for paying certain people. All right, so this is Thiel. I don't want to waste Bill Gates' time, Thiel replied. Thiel feels that giving his billions away would be too much like admitting he had done something wrong to acquire them. The prevailing view in Europe, he said, and more in the United States, is that philanthropy is something an evil person does. It raises a question, he said. What are you atoning for? He also lacked sympathy for the impulse to spread resources from the privileged to those in need. When I mentioned the terrible poverty and inequality around the world, he said, I think there are enough people working on that. And besides, a different cause moves him far more. All right, this is the living forever thing. One night in 1999, or possibly 2000, Thiel went to a party in Palo Alto with Max Levchin, where they heard a pitch for an organization called the Alcor Life Extension Foundation. By the way, this group is a Russian front. I just think people should know that, kind of pay attention to that. Alcor was trying to pioneer a practical method of biostasis, a way to freeze the freshly dead in hope of reification one day. Don't picture the reanimation of an old enfeebled corpse, enthusiasts at the party told Levchin. The idea, of course, is that long before we know how to revive dead people, we would learn how to repair your cellular membranes and make you look young and virile and beautiful and muscular, and then we'll revive you, Levchin recalled. Levchin found the whole thing morbid and couldn't wait to get out of there, but Thiel signed up as an Alcor client.
Should Thiel happen to die one day, best efforts notwithstanding, his arrangements with Alcor provide that a cryonics team will be standing by. The moment he is declared dead, legally dead, medical technicians will connect him to a machine that will restore respiration and blood flow to his corpse. This step is temporary, meant to protect his brain and slow the dying process. The patient, as Alcor calls its dead client, is then cooled in an ice water bath, and their blood is replaced with an organ preservation solution. Next, ideally within the hour, Thiel's remains will be whisked to an operating room in Scottsdale, Arizona. By the way, Scottsdale, Arizona is a notorious mob area. It's also where Chris Buskirk, who runs, who's a payday loan guy, and who ran Thiel's operations for the Blake Masters Super PAC, and who used the kind of sham charity American Greatness. Chris Buskirk, who by the way is a huge backer with Rebecca Mercer and Peter Thiel with Tucker Carlson's new outfit. So just pay attention to that Scottsdale, Arizona thing. All right. A medical team will perfuse cryoprotectants through his blood vessels in an attempt to reduce this tissue damage wrought by extreme cold. Then his body will be cooled to 196 degrees Celsius, the temperature of liquid nitrogen. After slipping into a double walled, vacuum insulated metal coffin alongside, so far, 222 other corpuscles, the patient is now protected from deterioration for theoretically thousands of years, Alcor's literature explains. All that will be left for Thiel to do, entombed in this vault, is await the emergence of some future society that has the wherewithal and inclination to revive him, and then make his way in a world in which his skills and education and fabulous wealth may be worth nothing at all. Thiel knows that cryonics is still not working that well. This is Thiel being quoted. When flesh freezes, he said, neurons and cellular structures get damaged. But he figures cryonics is better than the alternative, meaning the regular kind of death that nobody comes back from. Of course, the choice, if he had the choice, Thiel would prefer not to die in the first place. In the 2000s, he became enamored with the work of Aubrey de Grey. By the way, Aubrey de Grey very much plugged in to the Russian network. A biomedical gerontologist from England, who predicted that science would soon enable someone to live for 1,000 years. By the end of that span, future scientists would have devised a way to extend life still further, and so on to immortality. A charismatic figure with a prodigious beard and a doctorate from Cambridge, de Grey resembled an Orthodox priest in mufti. He preached to Thiel for hours at a time about the science of regeneration. De Grey called his research program SENS, or SENS, all capitalized, short for strategies for engineered negligible senescence. Thiel gave millions of dollars to de Grey's Methuselah Foundation and the SENS Research Foundation, helping fund a lucrative prize for any scientist who could stretch the lifespan of mice to unnatural lengths. 4 such prizes were awarded, but no human application had yet emerged. I wondered how much Thiel had thought through the implications of a society of extreme longevity. By the way, for those who are curious, there's a really great book by Heinlein called Methuselah's Children. This is Charles speaking, which I highly recommend to people about what such a society would look like. The population would grow exponentially. Resources would not. Where would everyone live? What would they do for work? What would they eat and drink? Or, let's face it, would 1,000 years lifespan be limited to men and women of extreme wealth? Well, maybe I self-serve, he said, perhaps understating the point, but I worry more about stagnation than about inequality. Thiel is not alone among his Silicon Valley peers with his obsession with immortality. Oracle's Larry Ellison, by the way, he's a very Likud heavy guy, he was very connected with Bibi, has described mortality as incomprehensible. Google's Sergey Brin aspires to cure death. Dmitry Itskov, a leading technology entrepreneur in Russia, has said he hopes to live to 10,000 years. If anything, Thiel thinks about death more than they do and kicks himself for not thinking about it enough. I shouldn't be investing way more money into this stuff, he told me. I should be spending way more time on this. And then he made an uncomfortable admission about the frozen death vault in Scottsdale, dipping his head and giving a half smile of embarrassment. I don't know if that would actually happen, he said. I don't even know where the contracts are, where all the records are, and then of course you'd have to have the people around you know where to do it, and they'd have to be informed, and I haven't broadcast it. You haven't told your husband? Wouldn't you want him to sign up alongside you? I mean, I will think about that, he said, sounding rattled. I have not thought about that. He picked up his hand and gestured. Stop. Enough about his family. Thiel already does a lot of things to try to extend his lifespan. He's on a paleo diet. He works out with a trainer. He suspects that nicotine is really good nootropic drug that raises your IQ 10 points, and is thinking about adding a nicotine patch to his regimen. He has spoken of using human growth hormone pills to promote muscular mass. Until recently, um, he was taking semaglutide, the drug in Ozempic. Lately, he has switched to weekly injections of Mounjaro, an anti-diabetic drug commonly used for weight loss. He describes he doses himself with another anti-diabetic, metformin, because he thinks it has a significant effect in suppressing his cancer risk. In the HBO series Silicon Valley, one of the characters, though not the one widely thought to be modeled on Thiel, has a blood boy who gave him regular transfusions of youthful serum. I thought Thiel would laugh at that reference, but he didn't. I looked into these things. By the way, that whole science around the blood boy and everything, that's a very Russian thing, and there's a lot of like interesting Russian research on this. I actually first heard about this. My beloved grandfather, the one I knew quite well, Colonel Carl Lundquist, who was CIA. He actually had one of those diagrams of this in Russian, and my grandfather spoke Russian fluently, doing kind of translation work and other things, which some of which are still classified. But yeah, anyway, I looked into these things, I don't know, somewhat heterodox, he said, noting that parabios, yeah, that's the procedure, as the procedure is called, seems to slow aging in mice. He wishes the science weren't more advanced. No matter how fervent his desire, uh, Thiel's extraordinary resources still can't buy him the kind of super duper medical treatments that would let him slip the grasp of death. It is perhaps his ultimate disappointment. There are all these things I can't do with my money, Thiel said. Indeed. Indeed, friends. Now, look, what are we doing here? Why are we doing these spaces? What are we about when we think about these things? What we are about is about restoring the American system. And what we are about when we think about these things is we're about calling out bullshit artists and fraudsters and foreign assets and agents and spies. And we are about making some of those spies allies of the US government. And we are about making some of them into Americans. And if not them, then their children. Now, I want to say just like one more thing about this, because I think that there's often a desire to beat up on Thiel or on other of these players because they're German, right? Or because they're Russian, or because they're Chinese, or because of whatever. And one of my attorneys, who is a dear friend of mine and who's been a dear friend of mine for a long time, is a man named Eric Weiss. And Eric Weiss is a lovely man. He lives, in the Connecticut area, and he uh, is the grandson of a man who was, well, there's no easy way to say this. He was a Nazi war criminal, at least as far as World War II is concerned. And this grandfather of his was actually assassinated by Mossad in Venezuela, killed with a pastry. And so I believe it was Eric's mother that grew up without a father after having been assassinated in Venezuela. Now, Eric has a number of children. They're all quite lovely. I've stayed at his home. He's not just a lawyer. He's a dear friend of mine. He represents me in the Clearview matter. And he's somebody who actually advised me not to stay in law school, I should say. And he's somebody who you would never know this guy. He's a quiet man, and he has a daughter who is at the Naval Academy, and where my other grandfather went, and where I tried to go before I was not allowed to go there because of my medical problems. Effectively, I don't sleep enough for the U.S. Navy. Tragedy of tragedies. Um, and so his daughter is, kicking ass and taking names at the Naval Academy. So there you have a guy whose grandfather was a Nazi and whose daughter is at the Naval Academy. And I think this is how it works in America. I think this is how we make Americans. And I think that there are lots of Americans who don't take up their duties and responsibilities, whether they showed up, a year ago or 400 years ago, or 10,000 years ago if they're Native American. And so I think what we need to be talking about here is what kind of duties are expected of those of us who have tremendous privilege. And for the political left, they want to live in a world where there is privilege, but basically there's commitments but no privilege. And the political right wants to live in a world of privilege but no responsibilities. And I think honestly, we kind of need to have a kind of nobility in this country, like a real nobility, one where the nobility actually signs up to fight in these conflicts, where they actually do things like recruit compromised billionaires and go into dangerous areas on behalf of Uncle Sam and spend months of their life in Ukraine or Turkey or wherever they happen to be. So I think this is how we survive as a society. I think it's not really, as Coolidge put it, I don't think it's survival of the fittest. I think it's actually sacrifice of the fittest that actually makes our system work. And I should say too, like there's this fetishization in the Thiel world with IQ. Um, Now, I've taken an IQ test. I've taken actually several IQ tests. Uh, I am by definition a genius. That and $5 got me a $5 foot long sandwich the other day. It doesn't really matter all that much because people aren't really known. They're not known for what makes them bright. They're known for what they've done for others, for the market, for the world. They're known not for there's not a privilege, to rule other people because you're intelligent. In fact, I would argue that being highly intelligent is actually kind of a disability in a lot of ways, that there are ways in which it impoverishes your relationship with other people. Just like having tremendous wealth is actually kind of a problem. It harms your ability to have close relationships with people you care about, people you love. It makes it hard for you to raise your children with the kind of middle class expectations that really come with being an American, and it makes it really hard to have meaningful relationships with your parents when they hit you up for money, even though they never were there helping you build the business empire you've been building. So I would just say, just like thinking about this, just like honestly and entre nous, because I know we have quite a number of people in this space and it is recorded. Um, I think we have an obligation here to go and rescue as many of these billionaires as we can, and as many of these compromised people, and as many of the people who basically are their lackeys as we can. Um, and, I'm willing to have that conversation anywhere and everywhere we can have it. And so, whether that's on Substack or whether that's in these spaces, whether that's, testifying before government bodies, whether that's in making our work speak for itself, the companies that we've built. Um, you see, there are some of us who don't really want to live for forever, right? That actually, like, we're pretty good with our natural lifespan because there are all sorts of ways in which our ideas, the things we care about, matter a lot more than our physical form, right? And so I think that is much more likely to pass on than any alcohol or whatever nonsense. So, with all that said, I'm happy to take some questions. Or to sort of chat about this generally. I we'll probably call it a night around 1:15 on the East Coast side, just because I have to be an adult and do adult things tomorrow. And it is Veterans Day, and I'm going to Arlington National Cemetery to visit my grandparents. So yeah. Anywho, yeah. Anything you want to add, Zonigal? Tom, am I missing anything? Did I get anything wrong?
No, that's nice that you're going to the cemetery tomorrow. That's a nice tradition. You've done that
Yeah,
before, haven't you?
I do that pretty much every. I do that pretty much every Veterans Day period. I also do it on the anniversary of when my grandparents got my grandmother's birthday is right around Pearl Harbor Day, and my grandfather got shore leave to spend time with her. And he was on the USS Oklahoma, and pretty much everybody he knew was killed on the USS Oklahoma. And then he went from there, and he was involved in naval intelligence. And anyway, so I'm Navy deep state on that side of my family. And anyway, that's sort of a longer conversation, just generally. So yeah, look, we're in the process right now of recruiting and turning a number of compromised billionaires, and that's what we're going to be doing over the next few years. And I put out feelers to some of them. I've made it very clear to some of them what behavior is going to be accepted and not accepted. Um, and we're engaging in an open conversation. And just to be very clear about it, I didn't move to Northern Virginia by choice, right? Like, I very much don't like this lifestyle that I've been trapped in. I would like to, I would like to be in Coronado, where my family lived, or in Wyoming, where other members of my family lived, or in Boston, where my some of my other family is. So this is something that, and I should say too, there's a lot of these oligarchs in our country, where there are ways to get them back, no matter how compromised they are, no matter, what's going on. I mean, I've helped clean up members of Congress. I've helped clean up people who've had much worse problems than some of them do. So anyway, welcome, Richard.
Hi, Charles. How are you doing?
I'm perfectly dandy. I'm having a LaCroix because we're talking about Silicon Valley.
It's pronounced La Croix.
LaCroix. By the way, the pamplemousse LaCroix, one of them was handed to me by Michael Chertoff, and he looked at me and handed it to me, and he said, "Don't say I never gave you anything." And I wanted to say, like, "You mean the Iraq War, or what do you mean?"
Yeah, exactly.
What do you mean, sir? But
you gave us plenty. Yeah.
You gave me plenty, personally, sir. But anyway, so I of course buy them every time I see them at Wegmans. Think of him and all of the problems of the world. But
well, okay, so this is my take here, and I'm interested in Thiel as well. There's some crossovers, minor ones, but in thinkers that I'm interested in, like Leo Strauss and Girard and so on. These are not passions for me, but
we should talk about Girard, and we should talk about Strauss, and we should talk about the ways in which Thiel misunderstands both of them, because I think that's
okay. Well,
very important.
that's interesting. I mean, I think that's probably true. I'll be honest here. The way that his speech on diversity was represented in that article you read leads me to believe that he could have given that speech in 1996 or something. This sounds
maybe did.
Yeah,
But
this sounds like this, like, hackneyed critique of diversity that we've heard. You can hear on Fox News. I mean, it actually doesn't strike me as particularly deep or thoughtful. I don't know. But this is my query, and I've asked you this before, and you've never really given me an answer, or at least a definitive answer from my perspective.
I'm sorry, I'm flawed.
Well, it's okay. I mean, it's speculative. I mean, one possible answer is we don't know, and there's no there. I mean, so from one perspective, I get this impression of a dark Thiel from left-wing commentary on him, of he wants to destroy the welfare state and engage in some Moldbuggian, like, monarchy of capitalists, and he's a genius and thus should control humanity and all this kind of stuff. But then you look at his actions, and I mean, when the rubber hit the road in 2020 and 2022, he throws money at Blake Masters and JD Vance. I mean, he's given them tens of millions of dollars. That strikes me as someone who does not, in fact, want to destroy the system, but wants to maintain the conservative movement, such as it is. and who's kind of playing around with these seemingly thoughtful, though ultimately shallow, religious right or libertarian types. And so he doesn't, when I think about what he's actually done, I don't get the impression that he's a dark lord of the Sith, trying to bring down the system. I mean, if you
No,
wanted,
I actually think a lot of that marketing just doesn't really work, right? I think a lot of it is actually, look, he's a man, right? He puts his pants on one leg at a time.
yeah,
He goes to the bathroom like the rest of us. He has hopes and disappointments like the rest of us.
right.
And in a certain sense, you have to separate Thiel, the political actor, Thiel, the philosophical, or the pretender of philosophical things, Thiel, the business person. You have to sort of take him apart and put him into all these different buckets, right? You sort of deconstruct him, as it were. And my view, for what it's worth, is that like Palantir could be a great company. It could be one of the great American companies, but for many years it hasn't been. It's been sort of mistreated, and it's been, Facebook is a kind of predatory thing. We need to be honest about that. That the news that came out from that Massachusetts lawsuit about how Mark Zuckerberg was told by Nick Clegg about all the ways in which Facebook was harming young girls. Like, this is exploitative, right? And there's a lot of Silicon Valley which is to some extent exploitative. And maybe there's a certain sense in which the Gen Xers, maltreated and mistreated by the Boomers, are actually visiting a lot of that mistreatment onto their children, right? Onto the children of the Boomers, right? Whether that's with online dating or all the ways in which we kind of know all the tech products are kind of bad for us in different ways. Um, Maybe all that's true, right? So, but for me with Thiel, I think that Thiel is a great pretender and that he's a great actor. And much like Musk and some of these other players, that they are kind of live action role playing, and that they are actually better suited not to the science lab or to the investigative, reporting wing of the high school, but they're actually players in a sort of weird drama. That they are actually actors and actresses, largely actors, to be honest, because not any of them are women, um, and that they are trying to enter spaces like defense technology, like intelligence related places that they are not equipped to go, and they are unwilling to negotiate with those of us who are a part of that world. And so we increasingly are taking them apart by raising real questions about their businesses, their practices, those kind of things. And what typically happens is that the US deep state will clean up companies. And we've talked about this before in these spaces about there'll be companies that get too predatory or too large, and they'll get turned in different ways. People will be turned into foundations. Arguably, this is what happened to the robber barons of yore, right? That's what happened to the Ford Foundation. It's what's happened to the Rockefellers, right? There's a certain sense in which you can never get too big. You can never get bigger than the state. And this is what I think it means to be small p progressive, right? Is to actually make sure that the state is the preeminent unit by which we organize ourselves. Now, there's lots of countries that like these libertarian nuts because they destabilize the United States, right? If the United States descends into a kind of chaos or a kind of disorder, then that's very useful to other countries. We're just if we're distracted with our own civil wars, right? Real or imagined, then we are not focused on building new technologies. We're not focused on doing really big projects like we were in the 1950s, right? If you think about great periods of American history, I think you made this point, Richard, actually, so I don't want to plagiarize you too explicitly. But basically, there are periods where when we have
Go
party
right ahead.
dominance, yes, yes, the great Richard on this point. There are periods where we have party dominance, right? That
Oh
we're
yeah, you're
actually,
totally plagiarizing. Well, thank you for
yeah.
acknowledging it. It's
Hey,
better to
hey,
be,
listen. I mean, you plagiarize me, I plagiarize you. It all works out in the end.
yeah.
Um, where does Richard begin and where does Charles end? I mean, it's all very unclear. Um, but anyway, so the point here, I think, is that like I don't look upon like a lot of these things as improvements, right? Like Mark Andreessen will say it's time to build, right? But he will then go and like buy all this real estate or do like weird crypto shit. And people like me and others who built real businesses that are now working with the US deep state, they've ignored those businesses or they've poo-pooed them or they don't invite us to any of the meetings or they blacklist us in different ways because we presumably have the wrong politics or the wrong ideas or the wrong pedigree. We didn't go to Stanford, right? So I think that there's a real question here of like how long this system can endure, and I'm here to break it. And I invite others to join me in that.
Yeah. So I guess to go back to my original question, I think it's just hard to pin him down, or it's like grasping a fish in it.
By definition, that's what he wants.
Yeah, but
He wants to be evasive.
it seems to be that he has some libertarian instincts. I mean, he delivered this paper in the 2000s. It was after 9/11, and I think it might have been after the invasion of Iraq, which he delivered a paper that he wrote, presumably, or worked with someone who wrote it for him, but it was called America's Straussian Moment.
Yes, I read that piece, and it's garbage.
Yeah. It didn't age well. Let's put it that
Well,
way.
it's just wrong. Like, if you understand who Leo Strauss was and what the purpose of Leo Strauss was, then you understand a lot of how the British intelligence services and later CIA were built. It was built out of identifying people who were very close readers of texts. Why was that important?
Right.
To interpret documents and to identify very clever boys, and they were largely all boys, to do the project of like actually investigating very serious inquiries, right? To basically identify the nerds, the reading groups, right? The secret reading groups that control the world. And Leo Strauss trained Harry Jaffa, who in turn trained me, right? And there's this sort of like, Straussian connection. Now, some of the Straussians got co-opted and were controlled by the Israelis or the neocons. They got kind of seduced by power. But many of us have not forgotten our Straussian education of like reading books very closely, of treating all writers as if they're liars, right? Of understanding why things are written in the way that they're written. Is there esoteric writing? You bet there's esoteric writing in every moment that we live in, right? There's always, persecution.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here, Charles.
I mean,
Yeah.
I mean,
at least with me. I'm sure other people in the space would like to hear this, but yes.
Yes. I mean, you and I and others in this space, like, we know that things are written in code a lot of the time, right?
Yes.
And that there are many levels to which things can be written. And some of that kind of makes writing and reading, that's what makes it sexy and fun. I mean, I certainly have a lot of that shit that I try to pull off in my Substack, right? So I'm with you. But the problem is that Peter is not a deep thinker. He's a LARPer. And he wants to be seen as being a deep thinker because he wants to be seen as a philosophical person, because that hides what his real businesses are doing and whether or not they're good for the world or bad for the world. And some of them are good and some of them are bad, just as he's a mixed bag, just like the rest of us.
Yeah.
And so,
I'd point out too.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I'd point out, Charles, that like in a certain way, this whole space of Professor Johnson closely reading the text for what's not in there, reading against the text, but also carefully reading the text is almost a counter Thiel philosophy in many ways. And it's so obvious that there's these two key pieces that are the problems of this Thiel approach to both philosophy and politics or even democracy. And one is this obvious like socio-political dilettantism, where he has all these different projects. He doesn't even know where his codes for his cryogenics are, what's going to happen with the seafaring islands and all of that. So there's just a dilettantish kind of aspect to like his work that shows in his philosophy too. And then the other part of it obviously has to do with the philosophical vampirism, because obviously he is some kind of, there's a vampire character. That's what the whole obsession with materiality and longevity and immortality and the flesh and blood. But the other side of that is the blood, is the sucking, is a sort of a an anti-dialogical relationship where people are just sort of corpses to you, where you seek to sort of draw the blood from them. And I get that sense from his approach to philosophy in a certain way. And I just want to point out one other
Yeah.
thing is that there's an accomplishment, I think, that's just shown through this Atlantic article about your approach to open sourcing counterintelligence, where you have two things going on. This is the first time I'm aware of that in this article, Atlantic, that is edited by this former Israeli prison guard, Jeffrey Goldberg, now guarding American mines. This is the first time that we've heard this whole thing about, Jonathan Buma and counterintelligence, and the FBI is paying attention to Silicon Valley billionaires, or Epstein and Israeli military intelligence, or the American deep state. And so that even just that knowledge that Thiel and you and Buma were involved in counterintelligence begins to sort of create a regeneration of the body politics sense of counterintelligence and defense, I think.
Yeah, I think that's an
Yeah.
interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, so I want to just kind of like, all right. So I host a number of dinner parties, and I used to host a number of them that Thiel himself would attend. And we would have these kind of close readings of texts. We would meet with each other. And there was a dinner party that I hosted in 2018, and the rule was, it was in DC, but the rule was that to come, you had to leave your phone at the door, and you had to make sure that you brought somebody who was not from DC. And they had to be interesting. And the question at the dinner table was the question was, what is a massive threat that the United States faces? And of course, everybody would say, China or Russia. I would sort of say Israel at the time. I was sort of needlessly provocative. But then there was a British friend there, and he said, the problem in the United States is that you all believe in cults, and you are all in a cult of one form or another, whether it's Scientology or Mormonism or and so on and so on and so on. And you get sort of sucked into these cults, and you fall in love with your cult leaders, and you'll do anything for them, and then everything blows up on you. And then you wonder what the hell just happened to you. And we sort of got to talking, this gentleman and I later found out that he was an MI6 person, kind of penetrating one of my dinner parties, I guess. And he told me that basically the technology world is a kind of cult. And I think when you think about Thiel, Thiel is a very exploitative figure, right? He's exploiting this Jeff Thomas guy who's now dead. He's exploiting, me. Like, he used my connections and my relationships with law enforcement to protect himself in a post, Trump era. I remember telling him that I was going to be a source for the Contrarian book, and he, said that that was fine. And then he sort of cut me off afterwards. He was so angry with me, and I told him to go fuck himself in his own home. Um, and I told him that I wasn't going to put up with any of his treacherous bullshit. And Thiel has made various promises to me, and some of them are in writing, and I may sue over them, to be honest with you, because I think that there's a level of charlatanism. You think about all these people who look up to Musk, or who look up to Thiel, or who basically are guided by these people as kind of heroes. They, passion themselves after Thomas Alva Edison or Henry Ford, right, in some cases. They sort of imagine themselves as these like great leaders in American history. Maybe the reason we haven't had as much technological progress is that these guys are frauds, that they are in fact not delivering these technologies, because Thiel was fucking around with Wirecard, or he was fucking around with Bitcoin or crypto or whatever. That's not even talking about all the drug money stuff with ease, or some of his other investments. And maybe it's all fake. And maybe
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
his famous line is, we were promised flying cars, we got 140 characters. I mean, I think that's a really interesting critique, but it's made by a man who got his billions by investing in Facebook. I mean, it's a kind
yeah,
of
and then of course you have the question of like Stemcentrx, right, which was a fake cancer drug, right? Or you have
You have all this fake stuff running around. And, look, the reality of the situation is the reason J.D. Vance is a senator today is because Congressman Matt Gaetz was at Mar-a-Lago, and Congressman Matt Gaetz appreciated Vance calling him up. They did not know one another, but Vance called him up and said, "Hey, I just wanted you to know that I think what's happening to you is wrong," after the whole Israeli contretemps and all that in April 2021. And Gates repaid the favor, right? The kind of loyalty that took place there. And that was the kind of backdrop there. And the reason Masters lost, well, for one, as I told Masters at the home of Adam Ross in November 2021, you can't beat an astronaut, okay? Like nobody's beaten an astronaut because of the way our system works. And you think about who are the people around Masters, and you have Amy Chua's niece, right? Amy Chua's niece is running his campaign. Amy Chua, of course, very tied in with the Israelis, very tied in with the kind of this weird network around her. And then you also have, the situation with Buskirk, which we mentioned before, payday loans, all of this. And then, of course, you have both of them getting money from the Mercers. And, what the fuck? So, yeah, look, I would just say that the truth of the matter is that Thiel didn't make a decision to leave politics. He was forced off the board and he was forced out of politics. And people like me did that. And we forced him out of it. Now, he can lie and say that that's not true. I have the receipts. I would suggest he not do that. And I think he should spend the next few years investing in and building up American sense making activities. Now, I think some of that may happen with what's happening with Palantir, which I understand got a very large contract today with the British services. And I do think there's a certain sense in which the British are very good at like de-Germanizing or denazifying companies, cleaning them up in different ways. Um, but we really should be asking ourselves these like larger questions here about like who the fuck is Peter Thiel? Who the fuck is Elon Musk? And why is it that we as Americans are so willing to go and just suspend our critical faculties? And why is it that there are all these children basically lining up to drop out of college? What is it about college itself that doesn't really speak to these people that they feel a need to escape from it? I mean, how dangerous is escapist thinking? Like these are things that I think are very, very important to kind of interrogate. So, yeah, I think, Jeremy, you're quite right about this. I think the vampiric aspect of Thiel, the kind of user aspect of this, is something that we need to think about and something that we need to really interrogate. So.
Yeah. I think there is, when you should trust your gut on it in many times. Sometimes your gut can betray you, but you should trust your gut. I think most serious people, when they hear about this living forever stuff, they just recoil in disgust. And there's something like inherently childish about it as well that's contemptible. But there's also there's a even darker aspect to it of what Jeremy was saying. I really liked his metaphor, which is poetic but also literal, of using other people's blood to last forever. I mean, it's the kind of thing that a supervillain would do in a comic book. I mean, it's just inherently grotesque. And it's often metaphorical. And the idea of doing it literally is just absurd.
Well, it's also wrong too, right? Like if you wanted to really study
Yeah.
why people live forever, right? Then what you could do is you could sequence all the centenarians in the country and do like a genome-wide associated study and identify the variants and look for traits and genetic. I mean, you could nerd the shit out of this, right? If you really wanted to. And if Thiel is serious about what living for forever and actually studying this issue, well, there's all sorts of ways that we could actually stand this stuff up. But I think it's not really about that. I think it's about paying off these various networks, and that many of these so-called charitable donations are actually like bribes. And I didn't want to talk about this part of it, but I will talk about it because fuck it. You look at things like the right stuff, Johnny McEntee's outfit, and he gets all this money after he helps put a number of Thiel's people in key positions in the government to run this like dating site. You have
Hmm.
other examples of like Rick Grinnell asking for a bribe from me, and I don't know if he asked for one from Thiel too, but you have all these questions about like why was he ambassador to Germany? Why, and there's all this stuff about Thiel's relationships with other countries. Why is it if he's such a patriot, if he's talking we, using the we phrase, which by the way, it's not a we thing. We didn't build these institutions. My ancestors and your ancestors built them, Richard. And by the way, we're happy to have other people partake of them and build them up in different ways. But this idea of a we issued by immigrants is always very curious to me, right? It's a very interesting. This royal we question is very interesting
It's
indeed.
it's a VVEC move,
Yes, it
you know.
is. It's
We
entirely we.
Americans
Yes.
believe in our exceptionalism, our nationalism that goes beyond. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and of course, like it's not true, right? It's fake, right? In some deep sense, um, they are LARPing as Americans, right? They're live action role playing, and maybe that's kind of like how the American Empire works, right? Is it convinces you that you're a part of it, even though you didn't really sacrifice for it.
Hmm.
But I don't think you really become American unless you make difficult decisions on behalf of perpetuating and supporting these institutions. That would be kind of my frame on it.
Hmm.
Look, I think there's this larger question, I think, here, which is the degree to which a lot of these venture funds are spy services, right? And that they spy on young people coming up. They process them in different ways. They look at which places they go to work on LinkedIn. They look at who they're dating and who they're not dating, and they blacklist them on the various social sites. They can ban you from Twitter, or they can ban you from Tinder, or this or that. They can kind of control you, and imagine how powerful that is from a foreign intelligence perspective. And, we've talked about Musk before, and we'll do a Musk space too, because there's apparently going to be a number of interesting stories coming out about Musk soon. But, you know, there is a kind of attitude here of like, who the fuck are all these people? And we've talked about this before, the basic bitch questions of like, who is your father? What does your father do for work? Who is your lover? What does your lover do for work? Who is your mother? Like there's all these questions about people as families. And for many of us, like the whole reason we exist in the world is to have a family, right? We love our family, love our children, we love our parents. And many of us do what we do in this world to try to be helpful and to redound to the benefit of our families, right? And so, like rock stars, you can never really ask a rock star about his parents. Increasingly, you can never really ask a founder about their family relationships, right? You can never really interrogate the myth that they're creating. And even the language itself, a founder, right? We used to talk about entrepreneurs, industrialists, right? But then we talk about founders. Well, this idea of that you founding a new republic, a new thing, it's explicitly a critique of the American system. And I think it's
It's
fair.
explicitly a kind of cult-like
Yes,
quality. I mean,
indeed.
I think that's an interesting thing because it's about believing in these, you know, businesses that are largely fraudulent and kind of like floating in the clouds. It's like a
Yes.
charismatic leader as opposed to an entrepreneur. Yeah, it is a different
Yes, and the
concept.
entrepreneur has a struggle, right? He has a struggle about what kind of world he wants to live in, right? Yeah, I
And
mean, look,
the rise of like founder language came along with Silicon Valley talking about culture as a cult of the founder in many ways. So I think those are very much related. And then even in terms of what you were talking about, Charles and Richard, in terms of like the inverse of a vampiric approach to the other and to longevity. Physically, it is the case that you go look for the longest living people who are also happy, and it turns out to be some French woman, 117 years old, who's eating her chocolate, smoking her
yeah, my
cigarettes,
great my
drinking
great
her
aunt
wine.
Elsa lived to be 107 in Oklahoma, and she smoked, she drank, she gambled her Social Security check at the local Indian casino,
and she said that the secret to her longevity was having a husband die when she was in her 40s and not having another man around, and that the secret was having dessert. So I always have dessert with every meal now because of
Yeah,
that.
so there's something to
For
do
death.
with the pleasure of life, and then another key piece that keeps popping up is relationship with family, relationship with community. And so it really is the inverse of the vampiric approach, that if one is interested in longevity in relationship to legacy, it's obviously the case that you give of your blood in both metaphorically and in reality, in terms of your long-term dedication to something bigger than yourself and beyond yourself, and that is the way that you actually can attain some kind of longevity.
Well,
Yeah.
we think about, I mean, if you think about blood, right? If you think about cannibalism, right, you're kind of left with Jesus, right? Like if you think about a Christ-like figure, like what does he do? He has everybody, take of his body and blood, right? And you eat him to basically live for forever, right? To have everlasting life through him. It's a forgiveness of sins thing, if you have a certain kind of interpretation here. But now we have another kind of paradigm of you work in my factory, you work on my plantation, you work for my tech company, and maybe I give you some equity, maybe I don't, right? Maybe I just work you to death. There's a kind of like, there's a kind of dark view here. And you look at like a Henry Ford, right? And Henry Ford, wanted a Model T. He refused to be seen or pictured even in cars that were not Ford cars. Okay, just think about that. Musk drives around in all kinds of cars that are not Teslas. And you think about it, what did he want to do? He wanted to raise the wage, right? So that anyone could afford the car. And he did this to have his pick of workers, but he also did it, and he had a whole like science of like studying. He had a whole hired all these invalids to work for him, people who had like one arm were missing, people. He had all this kind of racial taxonomy about which part of the car should be built by Czechs or by blacks or by this group or that. And which, by the way, like there's some really interesting stuff there. People are curious about this. Um, and he did all this to drive down the cost of a car, right? To basically have high wages for workers and yet to have low, basically sell shitloads of cars. And Musk was given money by the Department of Energy to build a Model T electric car, which he promised the Department of Energy at the time. I think it was Secretary Shu, I want to say. Um, Promised up and down, oh, yes, I'm for sure going to do that. Yep, uh huh. And then he never did it. He just built luxury cars or just more expensive and expensive cars. And to the extent he got his resources, he got it from slave labor out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which of course Biden in his first month on the job signed an executive order making accessing those resources much more costly, much more difficult. And I think now you're seeing in the DRC there's all these protests around the extraction of those resources and the extraction of all that stuff. And Musk, of course, tried to block competitor cars like Aptera, which, in the spirit of full disclosure, I am an investor in, but which actually is a cheaper car. And that's actually more, it's a solar panel, fuel efficient vehicle. So I guess what I would just say about this is that they kind of LARP as one of us or a being part of the American tradition, but they're not, right? Like, and I think there's something about mining here that we need to really contend with, right? Musk has the emerald mine family story or family lore. Peter has the uranium mining story with his father. And what are they mining from us, right? They're mining data, which is our behavior online. And they're mining us to learn things about us and to sell that information for ads and for other kind of things. So, yeah, it's very much an interesting question um, of what's going on here. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything. Tom, you shared something about this utopian city that they wanted to build. What do you want to go into that at all?
No, I was going.
Seasteading.
No, I think they're going to keep this one on the land.
Mm.
But I'd seen that talked about, and I was listening to a space that like a future citizen who's in our spaces sometimes. He was talking about it too. It's like a mold buggying thing that the ideas being put out there, like you're going to be the king of your own city state, and you know, it's very strange. And it was maybe like, well, is that a way they're trying to market like 15-minute cities to their base or whatever? I don't know, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Charles. What's up with that? But like this utopia, and they all left. A lot of them left California, and they're in Florida. And one of the lasting legacies is, what did they do for California while they were there? I mean, they've ruined it. So they're obviously not capable of governing in any serious sense. They don't take care of where they live. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's all kind of right on some level. Like, there's no great industrial projects that they've done in San Francisco. I mean, it the fact that San Francisco is so shitty, is a tell. I mean, look, they had an opportunity to invest in facial recognition technology and to invest in DNA to solve murders and whatever. They had an opportunity to invest in many of these things, and they all tutted them and made fun of people like me, who are actual real nerds who showed up with real technology. Um, and they're not very interested in that, right? So the question is, what are they interested in? Well, one thing they're interested in is each other, right? So they're sort of obsessed with each other. They collude a lot in raising of capital, right? So they will blacklist certain founders or certain people. They will whitelist others, okay, which is a mob tactic, and to a certain extent, the language is the PayPal mafia, right? And it's always ha ha ha. But what if they actually are kind of a mafia? And you look at it quite closely, and you look at, like, oh, David Sacks's father-in-law was in the Italian mob. Jason Calacanis, his dad ran a mob bar, right? And so you just start, like, looking at these things, and you start to raise real questions about what's going on. And it's not to say that I don't think that the mob can be patriotic. I believe it can be. We have to make the mob American again, and to some extent, having a patriotic mob, and the ability to talk to that patriotic mob is like why we won World War II, right? I mean, the relationship of the mob with the WASP deep state is a big part of the story, right? A big part of the World War II story. Meyer Lansky's alliance with FDR and the sort of the sort of various Italian families and their relationships, basically overthrowing fascism in Italy. These are all like deep parts of the lore that you're sort of not allowed to talk about, but which are very much a part of everyday life. And not everyone who came to this country, came because they were perfectly honest people, right, in the home country, right? There are many people who had their one-way ticket paid for by their neighbors to try to deport them to the United States. Um, and many of us come from that, right? So many of us come from refugee stock or from, disputatious stock. My family lost a war in the UK and was forced to come to the United States with the Puritans, God help them. And then, that's sort of what settled Massachusetts. So anyway, the point I'm making on all this stuff is I think that they talk a lot about foundings. We should be interrogating their backgrounds. We should be interrogating what kinds of businesses they're funding or not funding. Um, and we should also be raising these questions because many of them take money that's public money, right, from pension funds, from from endowments, things that are supposedly having a public charge. And we should be asking questions about how this money is allocated. Is it moving in ways that actually make the world a better place rather than just line their pockets? Um, I think this is all very to the good. And I think Sam Bankman-Fried, Elizabeth Holmes, it's really unfortunate that they sort of bear the full responsibility, right? Like Elizabeth Holmes got hundreds of millions of dollars from the Walton family. Like, why would they part with that kind of money? You're supposed to believe that the Waltons, oh, we were just conned, right? Like the Sequoia thing recently. Sequoia's like, oh, we were just conned by Sam Bankman-Fried. He just pulled the wool over our eyes, right? But like when I went to the Sequoia people with Clearview, they were using our product. right? Meanwhile, they were investing in a Chinese competitor product and of Clearview versus SenseTime. And so there's a lot of things where it's just like, please cut the bullshit. Like, we know what you are. You're a front. And you need to be honest about being a front, because when we understand that you're a front, we can actually figure out ways to work with the country that you're fronting for. And in the case of Sam Bankman-Fried, he lost a lot of money that came from pension funds. I mean, I think the Ontario Teachers Fund like lost shitloads of money from it. So there's a lot of questions here about like, what are you guys really investing in? What are you really doing? And I think that those questions need to be interrogated, and they shouldn't be done in this like stupid leftist way, right? The stupid leftist way concedes that Thiel is a villain, right? But if you have this idea that something is evil, he's an evil genius, right? People are turned on by that in a lot of ways, right? They're attracted to it. The more interesting question is he a fraud, right? And that's kind of where the real harm actually lies, is he's sort of a dilettante, right? He's fucking around all day. Now, there's a piece in the line about billionaires being bored. Why are they bored, right? What should they be doing with their time? Right? What does that reflect on them, right? What kinds of donations should they be doing? And then there's this question of philanthropy, right? Now, Peter fashions himself a Christian. Okay, fine. Like, we're all called to tithe, right, by our church, and I think pretty much every religion. I don't know, Jeremy. Does Judaism have a tithe? I forget.
It's yeah, it tends to be there. Heading toward 10% towards your local shul or something.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of like every sort of religious tradition I know of has a kind of tithing function. And in my tradition, we sort of talk about it being your time, talent, and treasure, right? That you have to give up 10% of sort of each of those things. And yeah, I mean, I'm by no means a perfect person of that, but I do try to do that. Um, and so I guess what I'm trying to say here is it seems to me that we should be asking, what are these oligarchs doing for our country? And what are these robber barons prepared to do? And we can have a polite fiction that they sort of decided to be charitable or whatever. We could also have the question of like, maybe they should be investing in things that are better. Um, or maybe they're not actually as good of investors as they say they are, right? Which is, I think, another question. Maybe they just got lucky and they had a zero interest rate environment and money was cheap and people came to them with ideas and they just sort of skimmed off the top. I don't know. That's sort of something to think through. I see we have a lot of people who want to come up. We'll do another 30 minutes because I'm feeling charitable and because honestly, I don't think I'm going to make my morning meeting anyway because I don't really want to go to it, but I probably will go anyway. And I'll just feel tired and upset.
Hey, real quick, Charles, do you think that Teal wanting to live forever is like his version of going to the Wailing Wall?
It could well be a kind of religious thing. I think there's something about homosexuality where you want to live forever in all kinds of weird ways. I think that's kind of my interpretation of it.
Yeah, Charles, I was itching to go there with all of this stuff.
I mean,
Um,
look. All right, hold on a second.
yeah, look, I'll just go there really quick. Yeah, the
No.
blood
We can go. We can go
metaphor.
there. We can go there. We can go there. Hardcore, as it were.
Yeah,
But
isn't
You
it
guys are gonna take your
interesting?
time with it.
we
Well,
can
the
take our time
blood.
on the gay question. I'm not. By the way, not that there's anything wrong with that, right? To borrow the Seinfeld thing, but maybe there is something a little wrong with that. Maybe we can talk about that as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, I think I popped out there for a second. The blood metaphor is your family's blood, or being having the blood of the Habsburgs, or all of this kind of stuff. That it's a continuous process, a kind of river that flows through time. And the fact that he's obsessed with stealing other people's blood so that he personally can live forever, like, this is evil. And even if it is stupid, also, and it's not going to actually work, and we shouldn't really worry about it, and it's just narcissistic, fair enough. But it still remains evil. I mean, who thinks in this way? Who would want to do that? Who would want to like literally be the supervillain in a horror movie? who's sucking the blood from people to. I think that was in Star Wars, the last horrible one. Isn't Emperor Palpatine's like sucking blood from clones or whatever? I mean, it's just
I don't know.
ridiculous
I
on some
don't.
level.
So your first vampire is Dracula, right? Like Bram Stoker and all of that. And there's sort of this question of like sex appeal and like men consuming women, right? There's that element to it. I don't know. Did we lose Richard? I guess maybe we did. So I just don't know. I mean, it's such a weird thing, man, that it's hard to know where to begin on it. Look, I think there's something about a just day's pay for a just day's work, and that's eluding a lot of the Silicon Valley world right now, of like how do you actually pay people what they're worth without basically giving them so much money that they don't work at all, where you have a retirement community like Google was. Um, I think these are really interesting questions that are deserving of a lot more integrity and a lot more intelligence than I think the Thiel position is. And I can't tell, I've read the piece now. This is the first time I read it out loud, but I read it earlier today, and there's a lot of stuff in there that's just absolutely ridiculous. Um, and I find it really interesting, just how these things go. And it seems to me that I don't really understand why we put up with this shit. So what I'm trying to say, like, why as an American do we give, do we care about this? You know, um, and it seems to me that we just love a con man in American history, and we love this person who has the mythical potion that lives for forever. I mean, it can't be a coincidence that Elizabeth Holmes' family had all these connections to these famous frauds throughout history, right? Like, I think her father worked for Enron, and then I think like one of her ancestors was like involved with the Iran Contra thing, and then another one was involved in I think like famous medical frauds or whatever. So there's clearly something about that, right? That's going on here, and I think we need to kind of like think about that more. You know, what's that thing? But I don't know. For me, the homosexuality thing is kind of more interesting in a way, that which is that he's got two children. Obviously he has them through IVF. He didn't have it through marrying a woman, right, or through like knocking up a woman, at least not in the natural way. And so there's a certain sense in which a lot of us are disciplined by our kind of crazy ideas as men by the women we have in our lives, right? Whether those be our mothers or our sisters or our lovers, right, or our wives or what have you, or our ex-wives in some of our cases. Um, and so there's a certain sense in which like male and female basically like balance each other in different ways. And I could imagine a sense in which you have so much money and you have no woman in your life in any sense of like kind of commitment or what have you, and you just kind of go a little crazy, right? You're allowed to indulge every idea you have, and many of the people who come to visit you, they indulge these ideas too, right? Because there's a number of things. I think Evan Baer said this to me one time, where he's like, you'll be around these super rich people and you basically pretend that like what they're saying is legitimate and real or whatever. And he said to me, "Is like, you don't really do that with these people." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't really have time to like believe their like crazy indulgences about how the world works. Like, I'm much more interested in actually like building interesting things. And if they want to come along with me, they're welcome to come. But like, I'm not really interested in like basically blowing rich people to get a few extra bucks, right? Like, that's not how this should work." And I think one of the problems is that we live in a world where the economy is so mobbed up, right? There's so few opportunities to actually really make real money on our own, because there's just so many of these corporations that are kind of like de facto, uh, they're de facto kind of fraudulent in some meaningful sense. They don't really work. They're kind of zombie corporations where people just kind of kiss each other's asses, and they don't actually produce a meaningful product. So yeah, I think that's all. This is kind of interesting. But anyway, you were going to say so. I know. Hold up, we have Jonathan here. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan. I hear
Yeah,
you.
I was just going to say it's kind of like I think it's some Plato book. It might be the Symposium or one of them where he says like, for some level, married people, they have kids and they live on through their kids. Like their being lives on through their kids. And yeah, Thiel has kids and maybe some of his ideas will live on through his kids, but he wants to live on forever because he doesn't have that direct spawn from him. Or I don't know how it exactly works, but it's just not the same as having a kid with a wife. So I think it might be something like that where he has to live on through his ideas and like what he makes instead of naturally like everybody else living through the people that you make.
Yeah, I want to be careful about interrogating too much his specific family life. I wanted to kind of base this larger question about
Yeah.
gay families generally. Um, and I should say too that like I am a genetic determinist in some sense because I think your genetic the way you actually live in that way is kind of interesting. Um, but yeah, I mean, look, what can I say about this? I mean, my takeaway on it is that I think there's something deeply sick at the heart of Silicon Valley. And the sick thing at the heart of Silicon Valley is the consumption of youth, right? The consumption, the kind of attraction and consumption of male youth working on problems that don't fundamentally matter, right? How many of us have spent the last few years like talking to people about startups that like didn't work, that were like fake, that didn't make any sense, that seemed just like meaningless things where basically the people were just on Reddit all day, right? They weren't actually building anything interesting. Um, I think there's quite a lot of that going on. There's like a lot of fake startups. And I think that there's a way in which this is a kind of transfer payment from the Chinese to the rest of our society. But it is a really interesting question of where does this all come from? And I don't know. I mean, it's disturbing on some sense, but anywho, let's anything you wanted to add, Richard? I know we have quite a number of people who want to come up and speak. Um, and I don't
What was
know.
my, because I popped out there for a moment, was my brilliant monologue on Emperor Palpatine, has
That
that
was
been
there.
recorded in the
That
Book of
survived. That
Time
survived.
or,
It's in the book of time.
oh,
You will
good.
survive. Yes.
Then I
Let's have
don't
Mr.
need to speak then.
Johannes
And you don't
Niederhausen.
need to drink anybody's blood.
Well, I might need to do that, but I see your point.
I don't know that I would even really want to be a vampire, to be honest with you. I feel like the time to have been a vampire was when you were younger, because when you're older, you just kind of I don't know. My grandfather died at 95 in 2020, and he was pretty miserable towards the last 10 years of his life. So I don't know. There's a certain sense in which living for forever
Oh,
can feel like
that's the
forever.
moral of every book about this impulse is that yeah, you're living as a corpse and your limbs are falling off and etc. if you try to live forever. Definitely.
I thought your age was like Frozen, like 35 or something. Wasn't that the vampire sort of story?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the only vampire thing I really know is the Bram Stoker stuff, and then I read
Yeah, it was your best image, but like when you weren't healthy and you were like in your coffin, you would have this like grotesque appearance that would like truly reveal your age. But yeah, um, I think it was
yeah, and
always
you
about the
couldn't look in
vanity.
mirrors, right? You couldn't look in a mirror. That was like one of the Bram Stoker things, and then you had there's all sorts of
Don't you
stuff.
think your don't you think your ball bag would like fall off at like 135 years old?
I don't know. I honestly
I think
like.
it would.
I had a great uncle who died. He was run over.
Earlobes and
He
ball bags. Yeah.
my one of my great uncles died being hit by a car because he was a lifelong bachelor and he was going to go talk to a 20-something-year-old. He was like one of those types that was always fucking. And he was very good in business and he sort of had the John Paul Getty attitude, which is that you should always be fucking. And that basically the second you stop doing that is when you start dying. And I used to make fun of that a lot, but I've seen a lot of like couples I know where it's very obvious they don't fuck anymore. And I think there's a lot of people that are like this, where they basically like plop down in front of the TV and they stop fucking and they stop eating correctly and then they just die. Basically, they just sort of decompose. Um, and I think that there's a lot of the capitalist system that likes this, right? Like in a certain sense, the insulin that people produce, for all the diabetics. I mean, this is a kind of vampirism. Maybe capitalism itself is somewhat vampiric,
in all kinds of interesting ways. I don't know. It's something I've thought a lot about, but it's distressing, to put it mildly. I don't know, Tom. You and I've talked about this before of like people sitting down and watching Fox News as they lose a foot because they're diabetic.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. They just ordering all the products, never moving from the TV, having like a mobile service come in and detach a foot because it doesn't work anymore. I mean, and that's exactly how I think they'd like it. Just don't move, don't do anything, and then just consume.
But
Just
what if
getting
you had a
smothered.
bucket of potato soup?
Yeah.
Yes.
Getting smothered by a My Pillow. I mean, that really is a
Oh, 100%.
deeply symbolic way of
While
death.
wearing the My Pillow
100%.
slippers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Being
then
I
if
mean,
it,
smothered by a
you
My
laugh,
Pillow is
you
actually
and
the
if
laugh,
it,
leading cause of
you
death
laugh. But my
among
beloved
Republicans.
father
I don't
is
know.
one of these people. My beloved father is one of these people that's radicalized by watching Fox News, and
I
I
think
think
the only thing that can save his company is if he starts selling like a my diabetic boot, my boot.
Well, your grandchildren figure out that you got a reverse mortgage on your house and then they smother you with a My Pillow.
That's right.
It's like everything is created by Fox News.
oh God, that's so terrible.
Now, come on, everybody.
That's so terrible.
Made
Good
in China.
heavens. Good
by a
heavens.
I
by a fraudulent pillow made in China.
I thought it was Egyptian cotton. You told me.
Nope, nope,
Do you
nope.
remember that? Do you remember when we did that research into that My Pillow stuff?
Oh yeah, that
Good
was great.
lord. Good lord, that was interesting. Yeah, I don't know, man. That's so fucked up. Such a fucked up system. Um, yeah, I think here's my kind of contention on this. I think that we just don't have time for this fakery anymore. We just don't. Like this is a serious country and we're going to be doing serious things in the world. So I think the Barton Gellman thing, so Gellman came to me to be a source on this after he'd kind of written his story. And I said, listen, man, here's the deal. I told Schwartz and others that I'd give them the story. You called me wanting to meet me. I'm in New York. Let's meet. Let's do our thing. And I was like, look, you need to understand that, like, there's a lot of us that don't want to live in an oligarchy, right? Like, even if we're the oligarchs, like, I honestly have met a lot of billionaires in my day. And I don't think I know a single one that's well adjusted or happy or has good relationships with their children or, I mean, they all seem like it seems like a pretty terrible way of existing in the world. And so I think in a certain sense, it's a kind of prison. Um, and so I think we need to be kind of aware of that, that actually, in a certain sense, we have to liberate these people as well. Um, Whether they want to be liberated or not, I think is an open question. But this idea that they just worked hard and they just got all this, like, please spare us. There's much more going on here than we want to talk about. And you think about the $10 million or $15 million that Thiel spent on Blake Masters. That money was spent on TV ads. It was spent in all kinds of other ways, right, of influencing the politics. So the question is, who was running that money? What were the deals like? What kind of houses did they buy themselves? What kind of percentage of the ad buy did they take? What are those people's connections? There's lots of things that we can kind of interrogate. I'm going to bring up Andy. Andy, be good. If you're bad, I'm going to kick you. I'll kick you really hard, and I won't think twice about it. It's one of those days. Go ahead, Andy. Good for you for raising your hand.
Well, a little bit condescending, but thanks, Chuck. First of all, Blake Masters' campaign was run by Amelia Halkalis, who is the niece of Amy Chua. Just a fact
Yeah, we did mention that.
that
We
might
mentioned
be
that
relevant to
already.
you. Secondarily, I did a little bit of research on nuclear weapons, and I sent you a video on this. It turns out both building and maintaining nuclear weapons is incredibly, astronomically expensive. To the point that outside of like the raw U.S. Defense Department of Defense budget. Sorry, I'm a little drunk. It's the second. It's like the second highest cost factor in the U.S. Defense Department. So, You talked about how you thought a lot of nuclear weapons were fake. Do you have any thoughts on the fact that a lot of Israeli nuclear weapons are likely fake, or at the very minimum, that the Samson option is a fiction?
Yeah, we've talked about this before in spaces, and I'll have you back up next time. But basically, yeah, I mean, look, my view is that a lot of nuclear energy is fake, and that a lot of these things are kind of fake in different ways. Just because I think that there's a lot of nuclear extraction from like the French colonies or whatever, where it's basically kind of slave setups. But yeah, I mean, I don't think nuclear weapons are something to really worry about generally. It's sort of not one of the big concerns I have in life. I'm much more worried about biological and chemical weapons, and I'm much more worried about like nutty gunmen who are like crazy people in the U.S. that are identified because they were posting QAnon memes or they were hanging out in Gab in white nationalist circles. I'm much more worried about those people being identified and used by foreign intelligence to kill a bunch of Americans. That's sort of how I think about it, for what it's
Can I
worth.
just point out one thing in terms of Israel and nukes? That it looks like that they earlier on when Demona was maybe more cracking, and there was intelligence chatter that Demona had gone critical or had suffered a fatal breakdown of some sort. And so there's a very interesting history of the end of the Cold War and, SALT 1 and SALT 2 and the limitations on nuclear weapons and decommissioning related to then Israeli smuggling of American pits, of nuclear pits. And so I would look at things like potentially the Israeli deployment of tactical nuclear weapons actually around the world, especially surrounding 9/11 and the post 9/11 era. Just go look at the forensics of what's known as Ground Zero World Trade Center, the Bali bombing. So I think it's more in that realm that the Samson option is actually deployed aggressively and proactively rather than the sort of civilization or European city ending kind of nukes that are threatened.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I've sort of written some things about my views on nuclear weapons, which I'm happy to, we can maybe do that at another time. Um, I'm very skeptical of the official narrative around nuclear weapons, just put it mildly. I think a lot of it is strains credulity would be a nice way of putting it. Um, let's bring Patrick up. Go ahead, Patrick. Don't all speak at once, Patrick. Yeah, I don't know. Tom, I guess maybe we'll drop him down. Um, I think just generally, when we think about these issues, we should make clear that what we're trying to do is clean up these companies. We're trying to clean up the people who are there. We're trying to salvage things. We're trying to fix broken things. We're not trying necessarily to be revolutionaries. And I think we should try to be helpful to a lot of these people because many of them are pretty messed up in all kinds of ways. And we should try to be helpful to them and kind of, accept them as they are, but also, call upon them to do big and important things. And I think just generally that's what's really needed here. But there needs to be kind of mutual respect, mutual listening. There's a lot of stuff that Thiel would say there about the government being ineffectual, the government being this, the government being that. A lot of that's just not true. Like, there's lots of examples of the government being perfectly great at all kinds of technologies. And I'd argue that in many respects, Peter should be more cautious with how he talks about this stuff, particularly when he's a co-founder of Palantir. I mean, does
Did he
Palantir
maybe say
work?
that because some of the people he wanted to jam into the government had what we would call issues with background checks and couldn't get security
Yeah, I mean that's
clearances?
indeed what happened with Balaji. I don't even think Balaji is allowed in the United States, where he like couldn't pass a background check. I mean, many of these people like couldn't get any background checks done on them. I see Richard's dropping down. Maybe that's our cue to call it a night. I don't know if anyone else has anything pressing they want to add. Jeremy, Zach? No.
I just say that there. I think that you know that I had my beef with you in terms of the way that you were reclaiming the deep state term, similarly the way that black folks were reclaiming the N word. But I do understand why it's sort of important, because my original theory of the case after Trump came into power was that we'd had an inversion of the deep state and a mafia state move in many ways, and that there's a hierarchy of the deep state where the national security services sit on top, and then there is then this relationship in a clandestine or covert capacity with the organized crime underworld. And so when you have that get inverted, you get into a real dangerous kind of situation. So at the very least, a very important first move of reform is to stand the deep state back on its feet, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, my view of it is it comes from the term Derin Devlet, right, in Turkey. And the idea of a Derin Devlet is a number of patriots working in the shadows to try to achieve national objectives, irrespective of what form of government is in place or how corrupt that government might be. And I think that there's something really to all of that. And, just in general, I think the problem that Trump had, and the problem that a lot of these guys had, is that they just thought they didn't think through a lot of their ideas enough, right? They just sort of wanted to wheel certain things into place. And there's a process by which we change people's minds. There's a process by which we engage in politics. And they're not really interested in process per se. They're not really interested in details. They're not really interested in a lot of the things that are a part of self-government, right? Honestly, this idea of like wanting a kind of quasi-fascistic system, this is not going to work, right? It's not healthy for the people who are in it or the people who are run over by it. Um, you know, um, that's sort of my sense of it.
Yeah, democracy takes work. A constitutional republic takes work, and it takes stamina over time. And that's another place where you can't have dilettantism and sort of go a few rounds and some electoral cycles or write articles or then hope that some great leader will come and fix everything. No, that's the point of the constitutional republic, is that we are all here responsible to govern for ourselves. And in order to do that, there's work that needs to be done both on ourselves, but also in relationship to sense making with each other.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that this idea of there being a kind of final form of government or a government that can get things done, it's like, well, what do they want to get done? Right? It's also not clear to me that our system doesn't produce tremendously impressive things. I mean, I hasten to think that like there's probably no other country on the planet that has produced as many impressive innovations or ideas. I mean, the Chinese steal our shit. We don't go over there stealing their shit, right? So like there's a reason for that, which is that like our society, makes and wonderfully interesting, intricate things that are very beloved around the world. Well, we have a very important system. I mean, there's a reason, Ben Franklin was an inventor, right? There's a long tradition of the founders being polymaths, and their polymathic pursuits made them much better as politicians and as statesmen and as servants of the republic. I think that there's a certain sense in our society in which a lot of our polymaths are discouraged from participating in government or are limited in different ways, and I think we are maybe coming back to that world in a certain sense. But there's certainly a lot of dilettantism around the Thiel network, which is really sad in a way. Like you see, like I remember having all these conversations with Eric Weinstein. Basically, like he's a fraud, right? And he's a spy, and like a number of these people are fraud spies or spy frauds or whatever, and we need to just sort of like show them the door. And I spent many years trying to clean up Thiel's network, and he wasn't terribly interested in that. And it's only when the FBI got involved that he's actually like trying to move in the right direction. And I think it's just unfortunate. It's unfortunate that it took so much. But we're now using the example of Peter to clean up other people. And I've seen that I have a number of people who are following the Substack, engaged in different ways, and I'm pretty happy about how things are going. I think there's a lot more work to be done, but yeah, I think it's all to the good. I want to thank everyone who joined this space. I know, actually, Kendra, you just joined. Is there anything you want to add?
For you, I have really appreciated the space so far, but Blake Masters and this that his his key project being the U.S.-Mexico border, and Peter Thiel's interest in technology along the U.S.-Mexico border. Do you think that can you speculate? Is that something that you see as dilettantism, or was there a deeper objective behind that?
That's a good question. Excuse me. We've talked before in these spaces about, my view on immigration, which is that ultimately internal enforcement is kind of the only way to deal with a lot of these issues. So there's a lot of people who want to grift off of the US border. And, there's all kinds of technologies, some of which work, many of which don't. And there's a long history of that kind of thing. Um, Look, the reality is that you're not going to stop a bunch of very desperate people from coming to the United States if they see it as their only option. Most people don't leave the areas that they're born into. Most people don't want to do that kind of thing, and it's really, that's really a big part of this that I think needs to be kind of understood. Um, I think ultimately, though, it'll be internal enforcement because many of the people who are here illegally are here because of visa overstays or what have you. So, look, I like Blake. Blake and I are friends. At least I hope we still are. I advised him to stay out of political life. I said that he wasn't really suited for it. He obviously didn't agree with me, and I think that he's going to continue to have problems running. I don't know if he'll win his congressional seat, um, but maybe he's coachable. I don't know. It's a good question. Um, but yeah, there is a kind of like grift on the U.S. border that needs to be kind of called out in different ways. Um, and I think the investigation into Operation Lone Star. I see you're from Texas, Kendra. All the investigations into Operation Lone Star, I think, are very important, and people should kind of take them seriously. But I'm going to close down this space, not because I don't love chatting with all of you, and I'm very pleased that we had quite a number of people here. I would recommend you read some of the things I've written up on my Substack. It's free. To the extent that you feel so moved, I encourage you to become a paid member just because we take a lot of the money from that and spend it on software and other research tools. And it's pretty well reviewed kind of thing. And yeah, I hope everybody has a very lovely evening. And I hope you have a good rest of your week. And I hope you think of our veterans, tomorrow, which is a federal holiday. I know it's oftentimes difficult to think about them, but do please think about them and the things that they gave up and what they went through, and think about the ones wearing the uniform and also the ones not wearing the uniform, because I think there's all kinds of efforts that go on to make sure that the United States doesn't end up in a real shooting war, and don't necessarily treat the veterans as if they are gods, but think of them as people who could have been your neighbor or who could have been your child or who could have been you, maybe, and maybe were you in a certain sense. Alrighty, well, I hope everybody has a very good weekend, and we'll probably do one or two more of these in the near term. But I am going to brush my teeth and go to bed.
Good night.
Good night.